Oscar Francis Perdomo was born on April 17, 1919, in East Los Angeles, California, into a family where revolution and war were family heritage rather than distant history. His father, Francisco Perdomo, had crossed the border from Mexico in 1916, carrying memories of riding with Pancho Villa's revolutionary forces through the deserts and mountains of northern Mexico. Francisco rarely spoke about those years, but when he did, young Oscar listened with absolute attention to stories about cavalry charges, gun battles, and the brutal civil war that had torn Mexico apart. The Perdomo family settled in the Boyle Heights neighborhood of East Los Angeles, a working-class community where Mexican immigrants built new lives through hard work and determination. Francisco found employment as a laborer in construction and manufacturing, doing the heavy physical work that paid enough to support a family but offered little prospect for advancement. Oscar's mother, Maria, worked as a seamstress when money was tight, which was frequently. They lived in a small house on a street where Spanish was spoken as commonly as English, where the smells of Mexican cooking mixed with the industrial odors from nearby factories. Oscar was the oldest of 4 children, which made him responsible from an early age for helping care for his younger siblings and contributing to the family economy. He worked odd jobs from age 12, delivering newspapers before school, sweeping shops after school, never complaining about the burden because complaining changed nothing. The Depression hit the family hard when Oscar was 10 years old. Construction work dried up almost completely. Francisco was unemployed for 18 months, surviving on occasional day labor and charity. The family struggled to keep food on the table and rent paid. But even during the worst times, Francisco maintained certain standards and expectations. His children would attend school regularly and learn to read and write properly in English. They would work hard and never steal or beg. They would remember they came from people who had fought for what they believed, even when fighting meant dying. Oscar absorbed these lessons completely and carried them throughout his life. He graduated from Roosevelt High School in 1937 at age 18. College was financially impossible, so he followed his father into manual labor, finding work at a metal fabrication plant in Vernon, southeast of downtown Los Angeles. The work was hot, dirty, and dangerous. Men lost fingers in the presses and cutting machines regularly. The pay was adequate, but barely, just enough to contribute to his parents' household and save a few dollars monthly toward an uncertain future. Aviation fascinated Oscar from childhood. Los Angeles in the 1930s was becoming the center of American aircraft manufacturing. Douglas Aircraft, Lockheed, North American Aviation, all had major facilities in the region. Thousands of workers built the planes that were beginning to transform both civilian transportation and military power. Oscar would watch aircraft flying overhead and dream of piloting rather than just building them. But flight training was expensive and pilots needed education and connections that poor Mexican kids from East LA typically didn't possess. December 7, 1941 changed everything for Oscar and millions of other young Americans. Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the war that had already consumed Europe and Asia. The day after the attack, recruitment centers were overwhelmed with volunteers wanting to enlist immediately. Oscar was among them. He walked into the Army recruiting station in downtown Los Angeles on December 8th, ready to sign whatever papers were necessary. The recruiting sergeant looked at his birth certificate and asked about his ethnic background. Mexican, Oscar confirmed, born in the United States. Native English speaker, though he also spoke fluent Spanish. The sergeant noted this information and asked about education. High school graduate, work experience, 3 years in metal fabrication, any mechanical skills. Oscar described operating lathes, presses, and cutting machines, reading technical drawings, understanding tolerances and specifications. The sergeant nodded approvingly. The Army needed men with mechanical aptitude. Then the sergeant asked a question that would determine Oscar's war. Had he ever considered flying? The Army Air Forces desperately needed pilots for the massive expansion that war would require. Standards were being relaxed to increase the candidate pool. Education requirements were flexible for men with demonstrated aptitude. Ethnic background was irrelevant as long as a man could pass the tests and complete the training. Would Oscar be interested in applying for aviation cadet training? Oscar answered yes immediately, even though he had never flown in an aircraft, had never taken a flying lesson, had never seriously imagined he could become a pilot. But the opportunity was being offered, and opportunities like this didn't appear often for men from his background. He would take the tests. He would try. If he failed, the Army would assign him to other duties. If he succeeded, he would fly. The testing process took 3 months of written examinations, physical evaluations, interviews, and assessment of aptitude and temperament. Oscar passed every stage, though not always with high marks. His mathematical ability was adequate but not exceptional. His spatial reasoning was good. His physical conditioning was excellent from years of manual labor. His vision was perfect. His coordination was natural. His reflexes were quick. Most importantly, his temperament was suitable. He remained calm under pressure, focused under stress, confident without arrogance. In March 1942, Oscar received orders to report to the Army Air Force's Aviation Cadet Training Center at Santa Ana, California, for primary flight training. He was 22 years old, unmarried, physically fit, and utterly unprepared for what the training would demand. The program was designed to break weak candidates early and rigorously develop the survivors into competent military pilots. The washout rate exceeded 50%. Men failed for academic deficiency, physical inability, lack of aptitude, or simply cracking under the relentless pressure. Primary training lasted 9 weeks and covered ground school academics, physical conditioning, and basic flying skills in PT-17 Stearman biplane trainers. Oscar struggled initially with the academics, particularly navigation and meteorology, which required mathematical calculations he found difficult. But he excelled at actually flying the aircraft once he could get his hands on the controls. The Stearman was forgiving of mistakes, and Oscar made plenty of them during his first 20 hours of instruction. But he learned from errors rather than repeating them, which was exactly what the instructors wanted to see. His first solo flight occurred after 12 hours of dual instruction, which was average for the program. He took off alone, flew the prescribed pattern, and landed without incident. The feeling was unlike anything he had experienced. Complete control, complete responsibility, complete freedom within the constraints of physics and procedure. He understood immediately why men became addicted to flying. This was what he wanted to do for the rest of his life if the war and the Army would allow it. Basic training followed at Taft, California, where cadets flew BT-13 Valiant trainers that were faster, heavier, and less forgiving than the Stearman. This phase focused on instrument flying, formation flying, night flying, and navigation over longer distances. The washout rate remained high. Men who had passed primary training failed basic training regularly when the demands increased. Oscar continued progressing steadily, if not spectacularly, earning adequate marks and avoiding the mistakes that eliminated weaker students. Advanced training took place at Luke Field, Arizona, in AT-6 Texan trainers that were the final step before combat aircraft. This phase emphasized aerial gunnery, dive bombing, formation tactics, and combat procedures. The training was realistic and occasionally deadly. Mid-air collisions killed several students. Landing accidents killed others. The instructors maintained that training casualties were preferable to combat casualties, so the program remained demanding despite the losses. Oscar completed advanced training in December 1942 and received his commission as a second lieutenant and his silver pilot wings. He had survived 11 months of training that had eliminated more than half of the men who started with him. He was now a qualified military pilot ready for assignment to a combat unit. The question was which type of aircraft he would fly and where he would fight. The Army Air Forces needed pilots for every theater and every type of aircraft. Bombers, transports, reconnaissance, and fighters all required constant replacement of losses and expansion of forces. Fighter pilots needed specific qualities beyond basic flying skills: quick reactions, aggressive temperament, excellent eyesight, good spatial awareness, willingness to close with and kill the enemy in single combat. Oscar possessed all these qualities, though some were latent and untested. He requested fighter assignment and received it. Fighter transition training began in January 1943 at Harding Field, Louisiana, where Oscar flew the P-40 Warhawk for the first time. The P-40 was already being replaced by more advanced fighters in most combat theaters, but it remained an excellent training aircraft. Heavy, rugged, and unforgiving of mistakes, the P-40 taught pilots respect for high-performance aircraft. Oscar learned to handle the torque from the powerful Allison engine, to manage the fuel consumption that gave the aircraft relatively short range, to employ the limited maneuverability and heavy firepower effectively. After 3 months in P-40S, he transitioned to the aircraft that would become his specialty. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was the largest, heaviest, most powerful single-engine fighter the United States had ever produced. Pilots called it the Jug because of its massive radial engine and barrel-shaped fuselage. The aircraft weighed over 7 tons when fully loaded, mounted 850 caliber machine guns, carried a 2,800 horsepower Pratt and Whitney radial engine, and could reach speeds exceeding 460 miles per hour. The Thunderbolt had specific characteristics that required adaptation and understanding. It accelerated slowly due to its tremendous weight. It climbed adequately but not exceptionally. It could not turn with lighter enemy fighters, but it could dive faster than anything in the sky due to its weight and streamlining. It could absorb tremendous battle damage and continue flying due to its rugged construction and air-cooled radial engine. And its 8 machine guns delivered devastating firepower when the rounds connected with target. Oscar fell in love with the Thunderbolt immediately, despite its quirks and limitations. The aircraft felt solid and powerful and survivable. Men flying Mustangs and Lightnings might be faster or more maneuverable, but Thunderbolt pilots went home more frequently when the fighting got serious. The Jug could take punishment and protect its pilot, which mattered more than theoretical performance advantages. By mid-1943, Oscar had accumulated approximately 250 hours of flying time across multiple aircraft types. He was technically proficient, tactically trained, and mentally prepared for combat. The question was where the Army would send him: Europe or the Pacific, bombers or fighters. The assignment came through in August 1943. He would join the 57th Fighter Group, flying P-47 Thunderbolts, deploying to the Pacific Theater. Exactly what he had hoped for. But before deployment, he returned to Los Angeles for 2 weeks of leave. During this visit home, he met a young woman named Dorothy at a church social dance. She was 19 years old, working as a clerk in a department store, living with her parents in the same Boyle Heights neighborhood where Oscar had grown up. They spent every available moment together during his remaining leave time. When Oscar departed for the Pacific in September 1943, they were engaged to be married, planning a wedding after the war ended. The 57th Fighter Group departed the United States in late September 1943 aboard Navy transport ships that carried both personnel and equipment. The voyage across the Pacific took 3 weeks, stopping at Hawaii, then continuing westward toward the war zone. The men aboard were a mixture of experienced pilots rotating back to combat after stateside training assignments and new pilots like Oscar making their first deployment. The veterans told stories about enemy tactics, mechanical failures, and close calls that the new pilots absorbed with varying degrees of belief and concern. The group initially deployed to the Central Pacific, flying missions in support of the island-hopping campaign that was gradually pushing Japanese forces back toward their home islands. Oscar flew his first combat mission in November 1943, a bomber escort mission to Tarawa. The mission was uneventful, no enemy fighters appeared, and the bombers hit their targets without incident. Oscar returned to base having fired 0 rounds and seen 0 enemy aircraft. His second mission was similarly quiet. Third mission, same result. The pattern continued through December and into early 1944. Oscar flew escort missions, strafing missions, and armed reconnaissance missions without ever encountering enemy fighters. The Japanese were conserving their dwindling air forces, refusing to waste pilots and aircraft against American raids that were too strong to oppose effectively. The frustration among the fighter pilots was growing. They had trained for air-to-air combat, had practiced dogfighting tactics and gunnery, but the enemy refused to appear. Some pilots joked that the Japanese had simply run out of planes. Others worried that the enemy was hoarding everything for a final desperate defense when American forces attempted to invade Japan itself. In January 1944, Oscar received news that transformed his life. Dorothy was pregnant. She had discovered this after he deployed and had written immediately with the news. A baby was due in August 1944, approximately 1 year after they had met and 9 months after Oscar's departure for the Pacific. The timing created complications since they had not yet married, but Oscar immediately wrote back asking Dorothy to marry him through a proxy ceremony if necessary. She agreed. The marriage was formalized through paperwork in February 1944, while Oscar was 8,000 miles away. The baby was born on August 2, 1944, a healthy boy they named Kenneth. Dorothy sent photographs showing a round-faced infant who looked exactly like any other newborn baby. Oscar stared at the photographs constantly, trying to connect the abstract concept of being a father with the reality of this tiny human being he had never seen in person and might not see for months or years, depending on how long the war continued. The 57th Fighter Group transferred to Ie-Shima in June 1945. Ie-Shima was a small island approximately 4 miles northwest of Okinawa, recently captured from Japanese forces and rapidly developed into a major American airbase. Multiple fighter groups operated from Ie-Shima, using it as a staging point for missions against targets throughout Japan and Korea. The island was cramped and crowded with aircraft, fuel dumps, ammunition storage, maintenance facilities, and living quarters for thousands of personnel. The group had transitioned to the P-47N variant of the Thunderbolt in April 1945. The P-47N was specifically designed for Pacific operations, incorporating numerous improvements over earlier models. The most significant change was the wing design. Republic Aviation had developed wet wings that carried fuel in sealed internal compartments within the wing structure. Each wing root could hold 93 gallons of fuel, dramatically increasing the aircraft's range. When combined with external drop tanks, the P-47N could carry over 1,200 gallons of fuel total. This extended range was absolutely critical for Pacific operations. Targets in Japan and Korea were often 800 to 1,000 miles from American bases. A round-trip mission required 1,500 to 2,000 miles of flying, most of it over open ocean, where engine failure or combat damage meant certain death. The P-47N could make these missions. Earlier Thunderbolt variants could not. The aircraft also featured a redesigned tail with increased vertical stabilizer area for better control at high speeds, an improved cockpit with better visibility, and strengthened landing gear to handle the increased weight. The 850 caliber machine guns were retained, as was the 2,800 horsepower Pratt and Whitney R-2800 radial engine. Maximum speed exceeded 460 miles per hour. Service ceiling was over 40,000 feet. Combat radius was approximately 800 miles with drop tanks. Oscar was assigned to the 65th Fighter Squadron, one of 3 squadrons comprising the 57th Fighter Group. His aircraft bore the distinctive checkered cowling marking that identified the group to both friendly and enemy forces. Each pilot was allowed to personalize his aircraft with nose art as long as it wasn't obscene or offensive. Many pilots chose pin-up girls, cartoon characters, or aggressive slogans. Oscar chose differently. He named his aircraft Lil May's Meat Chopper, a tribute to his infant son, Kenneth, and commissioned a squadron artist to paint appropriate nose art. The artwork depicted a baby wearing only a diaper, chomping an oversized cigar, wearing a derby hat at a jaunty angle, and clutching a rifle that was almost as large as the baby itself. The baby's expression was comically fierce. The overall effect was absurd and endearing simultaneously. Ground crew members laughed when they saw it. Other pilots joked about it. But Oscar was serious about the tribute. His son was back in Los Angeles, and this aircraft would carry the boy's image and spirit into combat. From June through early August 1945, Oscar flew 27 combat missions from Ieshima. Most were bomber escort missions accompanying B-29 superfortresses to targets in Japan. The B-29s could fly at altitudes and speeds that made interception difficult for Japanese fighters, but they were vulnerable during the bomb run when they had to maintain steady altitude and heading. The P-47N escorts provided protection during these critical minutes, but the Japanese fighters rarely appeared. American air superiority over Japan was nearly complete by summer 1945. Japanese pilot training had collapsed due to fuel shortages and pilot losses. Replacement pilots received minimal training and flew obsolete aircraft. The few experienced veterans remaining were being conserved for the expected invasion rather than wasted on hopeless defensive missions against overwhelming American formations. Oscar's first 27 missions produced 0 enemy contacts and 0 shots fired in anger. He had flown hundreds of hours of combat missions without ever engaging the enemy in the air-to-air combat he had trained extensively to perform. The frustration was shared by nearly every fighter pilot in the Pacific Theater. They were flying long, dangerous missions over hostile territory without actually fighting the enemy they were supposed to fight. Then came August 6, 1945. That morning, a B-29 named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, destroying the city and killing approximately 70,000 people instantly. The weapon was so devastating, the destruction so complete, that initial reports seemed impossible to believe. But reconnaissance photographs confirmed the reality. An entire city had been essentially erased by a single bomb. The pilots at Ieshima discussed what this meant for the war and their role in it. Would Japan surrender immediately? Would the invasion be canceled? Would they continue flying missions, or would the war simply end? Nobody knew. The official briefings provided no definitive answers. Japan had not surrendered yet. Missions would continue as planned until further notice. August 9th brought a second atomic bomb, this one dropped on Nagasaki with similarly devastating results. Still, Japan did not surrender. The leadership in Tokyo was divided between those who recognized that continued resistance was suicidal and those who insisted on fighting to the death, regardless of cost. Emperor Hirohito was meeting with his war council at that very moment on August 9th, listening to arguments from both factions, preparing to make a decision that would determine whether millions more would die or whether the war would end. Oscar Perdomo knew none of this specific information. He knew only that 2 atomic bombs had been dropped, that Japan had not surrendered, and that missions from Ieshima continued being planned and flown daily. On August 12th, he flew his 28th combat mission, another bomber escort to Japan that encountered no opposition. He returned to base, having fired 0 rounds and seen 0 enemy fighters. The pattern had become so consistent that pilots joked about it bitterly. The evening of August 12th, the flight schedule for August 13th was posted. Mission 507-35 was a sweep over Korea, a fighter-only mission designed to engage enemy aircraft and destroy targets of opportunity. No bombers to escort, no specific targets to strike, just fighters hunting for the enemy wherever they could find them. 53 P-47 Thunderbolts would launch at dawn for a 1,500-mile round trip to the Korean peninsula. Oscar Perdomo was on the flight roster. His aircraft, Lil May's meat chopper, was scheduled for the mission. He spent the evening of August 12th writing a letter to Dorothy and Kenneth, describing his routine life on Ieshima and expressing hope that the war would end soon so he could meet his son for the first time. He mentioned the mission scheduled for tomorrow, but downplayed any danger. Just another long flight over water and enemy territory. He had done it dozens of times already. He finished the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and placed it with the stack of outgoing mail. Then he tried to sleep, which was difficult as always before missions. His mind kept cycling through procedures, fuel calculations, emergency protocols, and tactical considerations. The P-47N was reliable, but not invincible. Engine failure over water meant death. Combat damage over Korea meant long flight home, hoping the aircraft held together. Weather could turn deadly if clouds obscured landmarks and fuel ran critically low during the return flight. At 0400 hours on August 13, 1945, the wake-up call came. Oscar, dressed in his flight suit, gathered his equipment and walked through the pre-dawn darkness to the mess hall, where a hot breakfast was available for pilots flying the early mission. He ate mechanically, fueling his body without paying attention to the food. Around him, other pilots were doing the same, some talking quietly, others eating in silence, all processing the upcoming mission in their own ways. The briefing began at 0500 hours in a Quonset hut converted into an operations center. The intelligence officer displayed maps showing the route, the target area over Korea, expected enemy activity, and emergency procedures. The mission would take approximately 8 hours total from takeoff to landing. The first 3 hours would be transit northwest across the East China Sea. The target area was the airspace over Kimpo, near what would later become Seoul. They would remain on station for approximately 1 hour, engaging any enemy aircraft that appeared and strafing targets of opportunity on the ground if no air opposition developed. Then the return flight south and east across the sea back to Ieshima. Weather forecast was favorable. Clear skies over the target area with unlimited visibility, light winds at altitude. The forecast for the return flight showed possible cloud buildup over the East China Sea in late morning, but nothing that should prevent safe return to base. Radio procedures were reviewed, emergency frequencies, identification protocols. The mission would maintain radio silence during the transit phase to avoid alerting enemy defenses. Once over Korea, normal radio communications would resume. The intelligence officer concluded with the standard reminder that helped nobody, but was always given anyway. If forced to bail out over Korea, evade capture if possible and attempt to reach the coast where rescue submarines might be able to pick you up. If captured, provide only name, rank, and serial number. Resist interrogation without endangering your life. The chances of successful evasion and rescue were statistically minimal, so the best course of action was not getting shot down in the first place. The briefing ended at 05:45. The pilots walked to the flight line where ground crews had prepared the aircraft during the night. Fuel tanks were full. Ammunition bays were loaded. All systems had been checked and rechecked. The P-47Ns sat on the hardstands in the pre-dawn darkness, massive shadows waiting for their pilots to bring them to life. Oscar walked around Lil May's meat chopper, performing his personal pre-flight inspection, despite knowing the ground crew had already done everything necessary. He checked the propeller for damage, examined the landing gear, verified the fuel cap was properly secured, and looked at the nose art, showing the fierce baby with the cigar and derby hat. His son Kenneth was nearly 1 year old now. Oscar had never seen the boy except in photographs. He had never held him or heard him cry or watched him sleep. The war had stolen that experience and might steal more depending on what happened today. At 06:15, the first P-47N engine coughed and roared to life. Within minutes, 53 Pratt and Whitney radial engines were running, their combined noise overwhelming all other sounds on the island. Oscar strapped himself into the cockpit, connected his oxygen mask and radio lead, and started his engine. The big radial caught immediately and settled into a steady rumble that he could feel through the entire airframe. The tower cleared the formation for takeoff at 06:30 hours. The heavily loaded Thunderbolts rolled down the runway in sequence, lifting off one after another into the gray pre-dawn sky. Oscar's aircraft was number 32 in the takeoff sequence. He advanced the throttle smoothly, felt the acceleration build, rotated at approximately 120 miles per hour, and climbed away from Ieshima, heading northwest. 53 aircraft, 8 hours of flying, 1,500 miles round trip. Most of it over open ocean where survival depended entirely on one engine continuing to run properly. Oscar Perdomo had flown this type of mission many times before. He had always returned safely. Today would be different. Today would change everything. Today would make him the last ace in a day in United States military history. But sitting in his cockpit over the East China Sea as the sun rose behind him, Oscar had no way of knowing what the next 8 hours would bring. The formation of 53 P-47N Thunderbolts climbed steadily northwest across the East China Sea as dawn broke behind them. The sun emerged from the Pacific, painting the ocean below in shades of orange and gold that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But Oscar Perdomo barely noticed the sunrise. His attention was focused on maintaining proper position in the formation, monitoring his engine instruments, and calculating fuel consumption against distance remaining. The heavily loaded Thunderbolts cruised at 12,000 feet at approximately 260 miles per hour. Each aircraft carried over 1,200 gallons of fuel between internal tanks and external drop tanks mounted under the wings and fuselage. This gave them the range to reach Korea and return to Ieshima, but only if fuel was managed carefully and no significant combat maneuvering consumed extra gallons at 3 times the cruise rate. The formation flew in loose combat spread rather than tight parade formation. Aircraft maintained approximately 100 yards separation laterally and vertically, enough spacing to allow maneuvering if attacked, but close enough to provide mutual support. The loose formation also reduced the concentration and mental fatigue of holding precise position for hours at a time. This would be a long flight, and pilot endurance mattered as much as fuel endurance. Oscar scanned the sky constantly through his canopy, looking for threats that probably didn't exist but might appear anyway. Japanese fighters operating from Korean bases were theoretically possible, though unlikely. Most Japanese air strength had been withdrawn to the home islands for the expected invasion, but intelligence was imperfect and assumptions killed pilots regularly. He kept his eyes moving, checking 6 o'clock behind him, scanning the horizon ahead, looking above and below for silhouettes that didn't belong. The first hour passed uneventfully. The ocean below remained empty of ships or islands. The sky around them contained only the 53 American Thunderbolts droning northwest toward Korea. The radio was silent per briefing instructions, maintaining radio discipline to avoid alerting enemy radar stations that might be listening. The only sounds Oscar heard were his engine, his oxygen regulator, and his own breathing inside the oxygen mask. The monotony was dangerous in its own way. Long hours of unchanging flight conditions created fatigue and reduced alertness. Pilots had to fight consciously against the tendency to relax and stop scanning actively. Oscar forced himself to maintain discipline, continuing his visual search pattern, cross-checking his instruments regularly, staying engaged despite the boredom. The second hour brought minor excitement when one of the Thunderbolts began trailing smoke from its engine. The pilot reported rough running and announced he was aborting the mission to return to Ieshima while he still had enough fuel and engine power to make it. The aircraft broke formation and turned southeast, gradually descending. The formation was now 52 aircraft instead of 53. These mechanical aborts were common on long-range missions. Engines failed, systems malfunctioned, and pilots made wise decisions to turn back rather than continuing into situations where minor problems could become fatal emergencies. Over the next 30 minutes, additional aircraft dropped out. One pilot reported navigation equipment failure and chose to abort rather than risk getting lost during the return flight. Another reported fuel transfer problems that would prevent him from using his external tanks, which meant insufficient range to complete the mission. A third simply stated he was aborting without explanation, which suggested either mechanical problems he didn't want to discuss on the radio or a personal decision that combat wasn't worth dying for today. By the time the formation crossed the Korean coastline at approximately 09:45 hours, only 38 Thunderbolts remained from the original 53. 15 aircraft had turned back for various reasons. The mission was proceeding with 71% of the planned force, which was actually better than some missions that lost a third of their aircraft to mechanical problems and navigation errors before ever reaching the target area. Korea appeared below as a mountainous peninsula covered in green forests and terraced agricultural fields. Small villages dotted the landscape. Roads connected the villages to larger towns. The Korean people had been under Japanese occupation since 1910, 35 years of colonial rule that had exploited resources and suppressed Korean culture and identity. But from 12,000 feet, Oscar could see none of this political complexity. He saw only terrain that could hide anti-aircraft guns and airfields that might launch interceptors. The formation turned north, following the coastline toward Kimpo, the target area near what would later become Seoul. This area held several Japanese military airfields and was a logical place to find enemy aircraft if any were flying today. The intelligence briefing had predicted possible enemy activity based on radio intercepts, suggesting that Japanese units in Korea were still operational despite the atomic bombs dropped on Japan and the increasingly desperate strategic situation. At 10:15 hours, the formation reached Kimpo and began a systematic search pattern over the area. The pilots scanned for enemy aircraft in the air or on the ground. The radio discipline was lifted, and pilots began calling out observations. Clear skies, no contacts, empty airfields visible below. No activity detected anywhere in the target area. The frustration was building again. Another long mission with no enemy to fight. Another 8 hours of flying for nothing except burning fuel and accumulating flight time. Some pilots began suggesting they strafe the empty airfields or attack ground targets to justify the mission. The flight leader rejected this. The mission orders specified air-to-air combat. They would continue searching for enemy aircraft. If none appeared, they would return to base without expending ammunition on secondary targets. Then, at 11:08 hours, everything changed completely. A radar station monitoring from a ship off the Korean coast detected multiple contacts climbing rapidly from airfields east of Kimpo. The radar operator transmitted a warning to the formation. Bandits inbound. Many bandits. Estimated 50-plus aircraft climbing to intercept altitude. The American pilots reacted immediately. External fuel tanks were punched off, falling away to eliminate their weight and drag. Engines were advanced to combat power. Formations tightened slightly for mutual support while maintaining enough spacing to maneuver. Guns were armed and checked. Every pilot scanned the sky with renewed intensity, looking for the enemy that had finally decided to appear. Oscar felt his heart rate increase and his breathing quicken despite attempts to stay calm. This was it. After 28 missions without firing a shot in anger, he was finally about to engage the enemy he had trained to fight. His hands checked his gun switches automatically, confirming all 850 caliber machine guns were armed and ready. His ammunition counter showed 3,000 rounds available. His fuel gauge showed adequate fuel for combat and return flight as long as the fighting didn't last too long. The Japanese fighters appeared at 11:23 hours as dark specks climbing from the east against the morning sky. Oscar counted quickly. 10 aircraft visible, 15, 20. More still climbing behind the first groups. The radar estimate of 50-plus contacts appeared accurate or possibly conservative. The Americans were outnumbered significantly, facing odds of roughly 4-3 against experienced Japanese pilots flying from their own territory. But numbers weren't everything in aerial combat. The American Thunderbolts were superior aircraft in many respects. Heavier, faster in a dive, better armed, more survivable. The Japanese fighters were lighter and more maneuverable, which gave them advantages in turning fights. But Thunderbolt pilots had been trained extensively not to engage in turning fights where the enemy had the advantage. The tactics emphasized boom and zoom attacks, dive from altitude, build tremendous speed, fire during a high-speed pass, extend away using superior dive speed, climb back to altitude, repeat, never turn and never slow down where light enemy fighters could exploit their maneuverability advantage. The Japanese formation was climbing through 8,000 feet, still below the American altitude. Oscar could see them more clearly now. The majority appeared to be Nakajima-Ki 84 Hayate fighters that Allied intelligence called Frank. These were Japan's most advanced fighters in operational service in August 1945. Fast for a Japanese aircraft, well armed, capable of fighting American fighters on relatively equal terms. The Japanese pilots called it Gale because of its performance. The pilots flying them today were likely experienced veterans because inexperienced pilots didn't get assigned to the best aircraft. Mixed in with the Ki-84s were older Nakajima-Ki 43 Hayabusa fighters that intelligence called Oscar. These were lighter and less capable but still dangerous in the hands of skilled pilots. Oscar also spotted something unexpected and almost absurd. 2 biplane trainers, Yokosuka K-5Y aircraft that intelligence designated Willow, were mixed in with the fighter formation. What these slow, obsolete training aircraft were doing in a combat situation made no tactical sense. Perhaps they had been caught in the air when the American formation appeared and simply joined the defensive effort. Or perhaps Japanese desperation had reached the point where even trainers were being pressed into combat service. The American flight leader transmitted brief tactical instructions: split into elements, maintain altitude advantage, attack trailing aircraft first, use speed, don't turn. The instructions were standard and expected. Every pilot knew the tactics. Now came the execution under actual combat conditions against real enemies who would attempt to kill them. Oscar selected his target deliberately. A group of 3 Ki-84 fighters were trailing the main formation by approximately 1,000 yards, flying in loose V formation at 8,000 feet. These would be his targets. Standard tactics dictated hitting the rear elements first, because the leaders wouldn't immediately know they were under attack. By the time warning reached the forward elements, the trailing aircraft would already be burning. He pushed his throttle forward smoothly and nosed the Thunderbolt into a shallow dive, building speed rapidly. The heavy fighter accelerated in the dive like a falling anvil, gaining 100 miles per hour in seconds. The airspeed indicator climbed past 300 miles per hour, 350, 400. The aircraft vibrated slightly as it approached its maximum design speed. Oscar's target grew larger in his gun sight as the range decreased rapidly. 2,000 yard separation, 1,500, 1,000. The Ki-84 pilots appeared unaware they were being attacked from above and behind. Their attention was focused forward and upward, searching for American aircraft at their own altitude rather than checking their 6 o'clock, where death was approaching at over 400 miles per hour. At 800 yards, Oscar centered his illuminated gun sight pipper on the trailing Ki-84 and pressed his trigger. All 850 caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously with a sound and vibration that filled the cockpit. The recoil slowed the aircraft noticeably. Bright tracers arced forward, walking toward the target as Oscar adjusted his aim based on where the rounds were going versus where he wanted them to hit. The first rounds missed ahead of the target. Oscar adjusted his aim slightly backward, and the tracers began converging on the Ki-84. Then they connected. Bright flashes appeared on the enemy aircraft as 50 caliber rounds struck at a combined closing speed approaching 600 miles per hour. Each round carried tremendous kinetic energy. When they hit, they destroyed whatever they touched. The Ki-84's engine cowling shattered under the impacts. Pieces of metal separated and tumbled backward. Black smoke poured from the engine almost immediately, indicating catastrophic damage to the cooling system or oil lines or internal engine components. The Japanese fighter shuddered violently, began a roll to the left, and entered a spiral that would end in the Korean countryside 8,000 feet below. Oscar released his trigger after approximately 2 seconds of continuous fire. He had expended approximately 160 rounds, which was 5% of his total ammunition. The Ki-84 was clearly destroyed, falling out of control with its pilot either dead or incapacitated. No need to waste additional rounds confirming the kill. He shifted his aim to the second Ki-84 in the formation, which was now beginning to react to the attack. The Japanese pilot had seen his wingman explode under defensive fire and was starting to break formation, trying to maneuver away from the threat. But his reaction came too late and too slowly. Oscar was already tracking him, already adjusting his aim, already squeezing the trigger again. Another 2-second burst, another 160 rounds expended. The tracers walked across the second Ki-84's fuselage from tail to nose, shredding the thin aluminum skin and destroying internal structure and systems. The Japanese fighter's tail section partially separated, causing immediate loss of control. The aircraft snap-rolled violently to the right, began tumbling, and erupted into flames as fuel tanks ruptured and ignited. 2 kills in less than 10 seconds of combat. Oscar's ammunition counter showed approximately 2,700 rounds remaining from the original 3,000. He had used 10% of his ammunition to destroy 2 enemy aircraft, which was excellent return on investment. But the engagement was far from over. Somewhere in the chaos above Korea, 37 other American Thunderbolts were fighting 50-plus Japanese fighters. The sky was filled with aircraft twisting and diving and climbing in the deadly 3-dimensional chess game of aerial combat. The third, Key, 84 from the trailing element, had seen what happened to his 2 companions and was now diving for the deck at maximum speed, trying to escape the American fighter that had just killed his squadron mates. Oscar considered pursuing, but rejected the idea immediately. Chasing a single fleeing enemy would take him away from the main battle and consume fuel and ammunition that might be needed for more important targets. Better to let him go and rejoin the larger fight. Oscar pulled the Thunderbolt into a climbing turn, converting his excess speed from the attack dive back into altitude. The heavy fighter climbed steadily as speed decreased. He scanned the sky systematically, looking for friendly Thunderbolts to rejoin or enemy fighters to engage. What he saw was organized chaos. Aircraft everywhere at every altitude, smoke trails marking damaged machines, several parachutes drifting slowly downward, though Oscar couldn't tell whether they belonged to American or Japanese pilots. Then he spotted something that made him blink in confusion. 2 aircraft flying in close formation at low altitude, heading northeast. The silhouettes were wrong for fighters. Too large, too slow, too awkward. Oscar focused on them more carefully and realized what he was seeing. The 2 Yokosuka K-5Y Willow trainers he had spotted earlier mixed in with the Japanese fighter formation. The biplanes were trying to escape the battle area, flying at their maximum speed of approximately 130 miles per hour toward safety. What these obsolete trainers were doing anywhere near a modern air battle made absolutely no sense. They were slow, unarmed, fabric-covered relics from the 1930s. They had no business being in the same sky as high-performance fighters, but they wore Japanese markings and were therefore legitimate military targets, regardless of how absurd their presence seemed. Oscar rolled the Thunderbolt inverted and pulled toward the earth, diving toward the 2 willows that were still several thousand feet below. The geometry was almost comically unequal. A 7-ton fighter with 8 machine guns and a top speed exceeding 460 miles per hour was attacking canvas-covered biplanes with a maximum speed barely 1/3 of that. The outcome was predetermined before the engagement even began. The Willow pilots saw him coming. They separated immediately, each pilot choosing a different escape route and hoping to split the Americans' attention. Oscar selected the closer aircraft and adjusted his dive to intercept. The biplane was turning hard left, trying to use its superior maneuverability to evade. But maneuverability meant nothing when the speed differential was so extreme. Oscar centered his gun sight on the Willow and fired a short burst. 1 second, approximately 80 rounds. The tracers reached out and connected instantly at the short range. 50 caliber rounds designed to destroy metal fighters tore through fabric-covered training aircraft like a chainsaw through paper. The Willow's upper wing disintegrated. The fuselage ruptured in multiple places. Fire erupted from the engine almost immediately. The biplane rolled right and entered a flat spin, trailing flames and smoke. Oscar watched it impact the ground approximately 3 seconds after he opened fire, exploding in a fireball that marked the impact point clearly. His 3rd kill of the morning. 3 aircraft destroyed in less than 5 minutes of combat. After 28 missions without ever firing his guns at an enemy, Oscar Perdomo had discovered something about himself. He was good at this. Very good. He pulled out of his dive and searched for the second Willow, but the biplane had disappeared. Either it had escaped into clouds, or the pilot had simply flown at treetop level where Oscar couldn't spot him against the terrain. No matter. One Willow destroyed was sufficient. Oscar climbed back toward the main battle, regaining altitude and speed. His ammunition counter showed approximately 2,500 rounds remaining, 500 rounds expended, 3 enemies destroyed. The mathematics suggested he was being relatively efficient with ammunition, but the engagement was still developing and more fighting was likely. He needed to be conscious of conservation while remaining aggressive enough to capitalize on opportunities. The main air battle had scattered across several miles of Korean sky as formations broke apart into individual dogfights and running engagements. Oscar searched for friendly aircraft to join. The checkered cowling of the 57th Fighter Group was distinctive and visible at reasonable distances. He spotted several Thunderbolts at various altitudes, some engaged with enemy fighters, others circling alone looking for targets or threats. Then he spotted something concerning. 2 P-47Ns at 3,000 feet were engaged with a single Ki-84 that had latched onto the tail of one Thunderbolt and was refusing to let go. The American pilot was jinking hard, trying desperately to shake his pursuer, but the Japanese fighter matched every move with the superior maneuverability that made the Ki-84 dangerous in close quarters. The second American Thunderbolt was trying to help, but couldn't get a clear shot. Every time the wingman lined up on the enemy fighter, his squadron mate flew directly into the line of fire, blocking the shot. This was a situation where a third aircraft with the correct geometry could make the critical difference. Oscar was above the engagement with excellent position to intervene. He pushed the throttle forward and dove toward the fight, building speed rapidly. The Ki-84 pilot was focused entirely on his target, watching the American Thunderbolt fill his gun sight, waiting for the perfect moment to fire the burst that would kill the American pilot. He was so focused on his attack that he failed to check his 6 o'clock position where death was approaching at over 400 miles per hour. Oscar came in from above and behind, the same attack profile that had worked 3 times already this morning. The geometry was perfect. The Ki-84 was flying predictably, tracking his target, maintaining steady flight while waiting to fire. Oscar centered his gun sight pipper on the enemy aircraft and pressed his trigger, holding it down for approximately 2 seconds. Tracers reached across the sky, converging on the Japanese fighter. Hits sparkled along the fuselage and wings. The K-184 shuddered under the impacts. Smoke began pouring from the engine. Then something unexpected happened. Oscar's guns went silent. Not a gradual slowdown as the last few rounds fired. Complete immediate silence. All 8 Browning machine guns had ceased firing simultaneously. Oscar's first thought was catastrophic malfunction. But then he glanced at his ammunition counter and understood. The counter showed 0 rounds remaining. He had expended all 3,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. The guns hadn't malfunctioned. They had simply run dry. He had fired approximately 500 rounds total across 4 separate engagements, which should have left 2,500 rounds remaining. But his mental arithmetic had been wrong, or his estimation of rounds expended per burst had been low. Regardless of the reason, the result was the same. He was completely out of ammunition. The Ki-84 he had just hit was damaged and trailing smoke, but still flying. The Japanese pilot, suddenly aware he was under attack from a new direction, broke off his pursuit of the American Thunderbolt he had been chasing. He turned toward Oscar, obviously intending to attack the aircraft that had just wounded him. Oscar Perdomo was now in an extremely dangerous situation. He was 750 miles from home base over hostile territory with an enemy fighter turning to attack him and exactly 0 rounds of ammunition remaining to defend himself. Most pilots would have made an immediate decision to run, use the Thunderbolt's superior speed to put distance between themselves and the threat, dive for the deck, head south toward the coast and the ocean and eventually Aeshima, live to fight another day. But Oscar made a different calculation. The Ki-84 was damaged and smoking. The aircraft clearly had reduced capability. More importantly, the Japanese pilot didn't know that the American Thunderbolt had expended all its ammunition. From his perspective, the aircraft that had just shot him was fully armed and extremely dangerous. Oscar could exploit that false perception if he had the nerve to bluff with an empty hand. The Ki-84 completed its turn and pointed its nose at Oscar's Thunderbolt. The Japanese pilot would see the distinctive checkered cowling of the 57th Fighter Group. He would see an American fighter that appeared to be in perfect condition. He would not know that the 8 machine guns pointing at him were completely empty and harmless. Oscar turned toward the enemy fighter rather than away, charging directly at him in a head-on approach that made no tactical sense for an unarmed aircraft. The maneuver was aggressive and apparently suicidal. An unarmed fighter charging an armed enemy violated every principle of aerial combat. But Oscar understood something the mathematics couldn't capture. The Japanese pilot was wounded, his aircraft was damaged, and he was facing an American who appeared willing to trade gunfire head-to-head at closing speeds approaching 800 miles per hour. That kind of engagement was deadly for both participants regardless of who had working guns. The Ki-84 pilot flinched. With his engine trailing smoke and an apparently armed enemy boring straight at him, he broke right, abandoning his attack run. Oscar followed the turn, maintaining the aggressive posture, keeping his empty guns pointed at the Japanese fighter. Every second he kept the enemy defensive was a second his squadron mates could use to reach the fight or for the damaged enemy to make a mistake. He keyed his radio and transmitted a call for help, knowing that somewhere in the chaos over Korea, other American pilots might hear and respond. The response was almost immediate. Another P-47N pilot had heard the call, had seen the engagement, and was positioning for a clear shot. Oscar continued his deadly dance with the KY-84, turning and counter-turning, diving and climbing, maintaining the bluff that his guns were loaded and ready. The Japanese pilot was starting to realize something was wrong. No tracers were coming from the American fighter despite multiple opportunities for clean shots. Either the American was showing remarkable restraint or something else was happening. The enemy pilot began to turn more aggressively, closing the distance, testing whether the American would fire. Oscar continued the bluff, pointing his empty guns and making aggressive maneuvers that suggested he was setting up for a firing pass. Then help arrived. A second Thunderbolt dropped out of the clouds above at full combat power. The pilot had the perfect geometry, high, fast, unobserved. The Ki-84 was focused entirely on Oscar and never saw the new threat approaching from his blind spot. 850 caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The concentrated fire at short range was devastating and absolute. The Ki-84 disintegrated under the barrage. Wings separated from the fuselage. The engine tore free and tumbled toward Earth. What remained of the aircraft scattered across the Korean sky in a cloud of burning debris and structural fragments. The Japanese pilot never had a chance to bail out. The destruction was so rapid and complete that the pilot was certainly killed instantly when the fuselage came apart. Oscar transmitted thanks to the pilot who had just saved his life. The other Thunderbolt waggled its wings in acknowledgement and climbed away to search for other targets or threats. Oscar checked his fuel gauge and felt his stomach tighten. The gauge showed numbers that demanded immediate attention. Combat maneuvering had burned fuel at 3 times the cruise rate. The fighting had lasted approximately 15 minutes, but had consumed fuel equivalent to 45 minutes of cruise flight. He did quick mental calculations. Current fuel state, distance to IE Shima, required flight time at cruise speed, reserved for emergencies. The mathematics were tight but manageable. He could make it home if he headed south immediately and maintained disciplined fuel management during the return flight. Any delays or additional combat would create a situation where he might not have enough fuel to reach friendly territory. Oscar turned south and began descending to optimal cruise altitude. The sky around him was clearing as the air battle wound down. Most of the Japanese fighters had been destroyed or had fled. The American Thunderbolts were regrouping and heading south toward home. Smoke columns rose from at least a dozen crash sites scattered across the Korean peninsula. Some crashes were Japanese, some were American. The exact count wouldn't be known until intelligence officers compiled the mission reports and gun camera footage back on IE Shima. Oscar keyed his radio and transmitted his status. 5 confirmed kills, 0 ammunition remaining. Fuel state adequate for return, but no margin for delays. The transmission brought immediate response from multiple pilots congratulating him on the 5 kills. 5 aircraft destroyed in a single mission was extraordinary. Very few American pilots had achieved that during the entire war. Oscar had just done it in approximately 15 minutes of combat, but Oscar wasn't celebrating yet. He was 750 miles from home with empty guns and fuel that would last exactly long enough if nothing went wrong, if his engine continued running smoothly, if his navigation was precise, if no additional enemy fighters appeared, if weather didn't force deviations, if mechanical systems didn't fail. Too many ifs, too much distance over hostile territory and open ocean. The formation of returning Thunderbolts assembled loosely over the Korean coast and headed south across the East China Sea. Oscar joined the formation and settled into cruise configuration. Mixture leaned for maximum efficiency. Propeller pitch set for optimal fuel consumption. Airspeed steady at the magic number that maximized range. Nothing to do now except fly straight and level and hope the fuel lasted. The first hour of return flight passed without incident. The ocean below remained empty. The sky around them contained only the surviving American Thunderbolts heading home. Oscar's mind kept returning to the combat engagement, reviewing each kill, analyzing his decisions, considering what he might have done differently. 5 kills. He had become an ace in a single day. The achievement was remarkable, but wouldn't be fully real until intelligence officers confirmed it through gun camera footage and witness statements. The second hour brought weather complications. Clouds began building ahead of the formation, thick cumulus that forced the pilots to climb above or thread through gaps. Oscar chose to climb above, burning slightly more fuel than ideal, but avoiding the risk of spatial disorientation that could occur when flying through thick clouds without reliable instruments or recent practice. The fuel gauge continued its steady march toward empty. Oscar checked it obsessively, calculating and recalculating whether the remaining fuel would suffice. The mathematics said yes, but barely. No margin for error, no allowance for unexpected contingencies, just enough if everything went perfectly. The third hour brought IE Shima into view on the horizon. The small island appeared as a dark smudge against the lighter ocean. Oscar felt relief wash over him, despite knowing the mission wasn't over until the aircraft was safely on the ground with the engine shut down. Distance remaining approximately 100 miles. Fuel remaining approximately enough for 120 miles of cruise flight. The margin was adequate but uncomfortably small. The formation descended toward the island and entered the landing pattern. Aircraft spread out to avoid collision risk during the approach and landing sequence. Oscar's turn came. He configured for landing, lowering his landing gear and flaps, reducing power, setting up for the approach to the runway. The Thunderbolt settled onto the concrete smoothly and rolled out, brakes applied gently to slow without excessive wear. Oscar taxied to his assigned parking area and shut down the engine. The big radial coughed and went silent. He sat in the cockpit for a moment, processing what had just happened. 8 hours of flying, 750 miles each way over mostly open ocean, 15 minutes of combat, 5 enemy aircraft destroyed, 3,000 rounds of ammunition expended. An ace in a single day. The last pilot in United States history to achieve that distinction. Ground crew members were already approaching the aircraft, ready to refuel and rearm for whatever missions might come next. Oscar unbuckled his harness, removed his helmet and oxygen mask, and climbed down from the cockpit. His legs were stiff from 8 hours of sitting in the cramped fighter. His flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the cold at altitude. He was exhausted and exhilarated simultaneously. The intelligence officers would want his report immediately. Gun camera footage would need to be reviewed. Witness statements would be compiled. The 5 kills would need to be confirmed officially before they became part of the permanent record. But standing on the concrete hardstand on Aeshima on the afternoon of August 13, 1945, Oscar Perdomo knew what he had accomplished. 5 aircraft destroyed, empty guns, survival through skill and luck and nerve. The meat chopper had earned its name. Oscar Perdomo had earned his place in history. And the war that everyone thought would last another year was 48 hours from ending. Oscar Perdomo walked from the flight line to the operations building at approximately 1500 hours on August 13, 1945, still wearing his sweat-soaked flight suit and carrying his helmet and parachute harness. Other pilots from the mission were converging on the same building, some looking exhausted, others animated and talking rapidly about their combat experiences. The intelligence officers were waiting inside to begin the debriefing process that would document what had happened over Korea that morning. The debriefing room was crowded with pilots, intelligence officers, and administrative personnel. The atmosphere was charged with excitement and nervous energy. This had been the first major air combat engagement for the 57th Fighter Group in weeks. After endless missions with 0 enemy contact, the Japanese had finally appeared in force, and the Americans had responded with overwhelming effectiveness. Preliminary reports suggested heavy enemy losses with minimal American casualties. The intelligence officers worked systematically through the returning pilots, interviewing each one individually about what they had observed, who they had engaged, and what results they had achieved. The process was detailed and time-consuming. Each pilot had to describe his actions chronologically, identify the types of enemy aircraft engaged, estimate the ranges at which he had fired, describe the observed results of his attacks, and provide any supporting evidence, such as gun camera footage or witness testimony from other pilots. When Oscar's turn came, he sat across from Lieutenant Morrison, the squadron intelligence officer, and began his account. The mission had proceeded normally until approximately 1100 hours when radar detected enemy aircraft climbing to intercept. The formation had dropped external tanks and engaged the enemy at approximately 11:23 hours over the Kimpo area. Oscar had selected 3 Kai-84 fighters trailing the main enemy formation and had attacked from above using standard boom and zoom tactics. Morrison interrupted to ask specific questions. What was the altitude of the engagement? Approximately 8,000 feet initially. What was Oscar's diving speed during the attack? Approximately 400 miles per hour. At what range did he open fire? approximately 800 yards, closing to perhaps 400 yards during the burst. How long did he fire? Approximately 2 seconds per burst. What were the observed results? Oscar described watching the first Ki-84 take hits on the engine cowling, begin trailing black smoke, and enter an uncontrolled spiral. The second aircraft had been hit across the fuselage and had partially broken apart before catching fire. Both aircraft were clearly destroyed with no possibility of survival or recovery. Morrison noted this information and asked about the third aircraft in the group. Oscar explained that the third Ki-84 had fled after seeing his two companions destroyed, and Oscar had chosen not to pursue. The questioning continued. What happened next? Oscar had climbed to search for additional targets and had spotted two Yokosuka K-5Y Willow trainers attempting to escape the combat area at low altitude. He had attacked the closer aircraft. Morrison stopped him again. Willow trainers? Biplanes? Oscar confirmed. Two fabric-covered training aircraft painted in Japanese markings, flying at approximately 800 feet heading northeast. What were they doing in a combat zone? Oscar had no explanation. They were simply there, and he had engaged them as legitimate military targets. Morrison asked about the attack profile. Oscar had rolled inverted and pulled into a dive, intercepted the Willow from above and behind, and fired a short burst of approximately 1 second. The biplane had disintegrated immediately, caught fire, and impacted the ground. Total time from initiating the attack to observing the crash was perhaps 5 seconds. The second Willow had escaped. Morrison noted this and moved on. What was Oscar's ammunition state after 3 kills? Approximately 2,500 rounds remaining from the original 3,000. What happened next? Oscar had climbed back to altitude and observed 2 friendly Thunderbolts engaged with a Ki-84 that was pursuing one of them. He had positioned above the engagement and attacked the Ki-84 from behind while it was focused on attacking the American aircraft. Morrison asked for details about this engagement. Oscar described diving on the enemy fighter, opening fire at approximately the same range as his previous attacks, observing hits and smoke from the damaged aircraft. Then his guns had ceased firing. All 8 machine guns simultaneously silent. Why? Oscar had checked his ammunition counter and discovered he was completely out of ammunition. He had expended all 3,000 rounds across 4 separate engagements. Morrison's eyebrows rose noticeably. 0 ammunition remaining, 750 miles from home. What did Oscar do? Oscar explained that the damaged Ki-84 had turned to attack him, and he had charged it head-on despite having empty guns, bluffing the Japanese pilot into breaking off. He had called for help, and another American pilot had arrived and destroyed the Ki-84 with gun camera footage that should confirm the kill. Morrison sat back in his chair and looked at Oscar with an expression mixing disbelief and respect. 5 aircraft destroyed, empty guns, bluffing an enemy fighter. The story sounded almost too dramatic to be true, but other pilots had already mentioned seeing Oscar's aircraft maneuvering aggressively against a damaged Ki-84 without firing, and the pilot who had delivered the final shots had confirmed helping Oscar with an enemy that was attacking an unarmed friendly aircraft. The critical evidence would be the gun camera footage. Every P-47N carried a camera synchronized with the guns that automatically filmed whenever the trigger was pressed. The footage would show exactly what Oscar had fired at, whether his rounds had connected, and what results had occurred. Morrison indicated that Oscar's aircraft would be serviced immediately and the gun camera film would be developed as priority. The footage should be available for review by tomorrow morning. Oscar was dismissed from the debriefing at approximately 1600 hours. He walked to his quarters, stripped off his flight suit, and stood under a cold outdoor shower that washed away 8 hours of accumulated sweat and fatigue. Other pilots were doing the same, talking about the mission, comparing experiences, celebrating survival. The consensus was that the mission had been a significant success. Heavy enemy losses, light American casualties, good hunting all around. The evening meal in the officers' mess was celebratory despite the basic food. Pilots who had scored kills were congratulated. Those who hadn't engaged the enemy listened to combat stories with varying degrees of envy and relief. Oscar ate mechanically, still processing what had happened that morning. 5 kills, ace in a day, empty guns, the bluff that had worked. His mind kept replaying each engagement, analyzing his decisions, wondering if he had been skillful or simply lucky. After dinner, Oscar walked to the area where his aircraft was parked for post-flight servicing. Ground crew members were swarming over Lil May's meat chopper, refueling the tanks, inspecting for battle damage, preparing the aircraft for its next mission. The crew chief, Staff Sergeant Williams, approached Oscar with a mixture of pride and concern visible on his face. Williams reported that the aircraft had returned in excellent mechanical condition despite the extended mission and combat maneuvering. The engine had performed flawlessly. All systems had functioned properly. But the ammunition situation was notable. All 8 guns were completely empty. Every single round expended. 3,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition fired in approximately 15 minutes of combat. Williams had never seen a pilot come back with exactly 0 rounds remaining. Usually, pilots returned with partial loads or occasionally completely full if they never engaged. But 0 rounds suggested either excellent marksmanship or poor ammunition management, depending on interpretation. Oscar explained that he had engaged 5 separate targets and had destroyed all 5, which justified the ammunition expenditure. Williams's expression changed immediately from concern to congratulations. 5 kills. That was extraordinary. The crew chief shook Oscar's hand enthusiastically and promised that the aircraft would be rearmed and ready for the next mission tomorrow. The baby with the cigar and derby hat painted on the nose had proven to be an accurate representation. The meat chopper had indeed chopped meat today. Oscar returned to his quarters and tried to write a letter to Dorothy describing the day's events, but the words wouldn't come properly. How did he explain 5 kills and empty guns and bluffing an enemy fighter to someone who had never flown combat missions and couldn't understand the unique combination of terror and exhilaration that combat produced? He wrote a short letter mentioning he had finally engaged enemy aircraft and had been successful, but providing no dramatic details. The official reports would eventually reach Dorothy through channels if the kills were confirmed. Better to keep the letter simple and focused on his hope that the war would end soon. Sleep came poorly that night, despite exhaustion. Oscar's mind kept cycling through the mission, replaying each engagement, wondering about the Japanese pilots he had killed. Did they have families? Had they written letters to wives or girlfriends before taking off that morning? Had they expected to survive the day? These thoughts were pointless and morbid, but unavoidable. He had killed 5 men today, 5 human beings with names and histories and futures that had ended when .50 caliber rounds tore through their aircraft. This was war, and killing enemies was the purpose of being a fighter pilot. But the abstract concept of combat was very different from the concrete reality of watching aircraft disintegrate and knowing men were dying inside them. Morning came early on August 14th. Oscar was scheduled for another mission that afternoon, a bomber escort to Japan. But first came the gun camera footage review. Morrison had left word that Oscar should report to the intelligence section at 0900 hours to view his combat footage from yesterday. The film had been developed overnight and was ready for projection. Morrison set up the 16mm projector in a small briefing room and threaded the film carefully. Several other intelligence officers were present to review the footage and provide independent verification of Oscar's claims. The lights were dimmed and the projector began running. The footage was surprisingly clear despite the vibration and movement during combat. The camera had captured exactly what Oscar remembered seeing through his gun sight. The first sequence showed the initial attack on the 3 key 84 fighters. The image showed empty sky. Then the enemy formation appeared at the top of the frame, growing larger as Oscar dove toward them. The gun sight Pipper centered on the trailing aircraft. Tracers reached out. Hits sparkled on the Ki-84's engine cowling. Smoke erupted. The aircraft rolled and spiraled out of the frame. Morrison stopped the projector and made notes. Kill number 1 confirmed. Ki-84 fighter, destroyed by gunfire. The projector resumed. The second sequence showed Oscar shifting his aim to the second Ki-84. The targeting was almost identical to the first attack. Tracers connecting, hits visible along the fuselage, the tail section separating, flames erupting, the aircraft tumbling out of control. Morrison noted kill number 2 confirmed. Another Ki-84. The intelligence officers were nodding approvingly. The footage was conclusive. Both kills were undeniable. The third sequence showed the attack on the Willow trainer. The biplane appeared in the frame, small and fragile-looking compared to the Ki-84s. The burst was shorter than the previous attacks. The Willow came apart almost instantly under the .50 caliber fire, wings separating, fuselage rupturing, the entire aircraft disintegrating in flames. The footage clearly showed it was a biplane trainer rather than a combat fighter, which would make this kill somewhat unusual in the records, but still completely legitimate. Morrison confirmed kill number 3, Yokosuka K-5Y Willow trainer. The fourth sequence was the most dramatic. The footage showed Oscar diving on the Ki-84 that was pursuing a friendly Thunderbolt. The targeting was precise. The burst connected solidly. Smoke poured from the damaged aircraft. Then the footage went black as Oscar's ammunition ran out and the camera stopped recording since it was synchronized to the guns. Morrison rewound the film and played the fourth engagement again, watching carefully. The Ki-84 was definitely hit and definitely damaged. Smoke was clearly visible. But was it destroyed? The footage didn't show the aircraft being completely destroyed or crashing because Oscar's guns had run dry before that occurred. This created ambiguity. Was it a kill or just a probable? Morrison discussed this with the other intelligence officers. They reviewed squadron radio transcripts from the mission. Multiple pilots had transmitted observations about Oscar's fifth kill, including the pilot who had finished off the damaged Ki-84 after Oscar ran out of ammunition. The consensus was that Oscar had damaged the aircraft sufficiently that it was combat ineffective and would have crashed even without the final shots from the other pilot. Therefore, Oscar should receive credit for kill number 4. But there was disagreement about kill number 5. Oscar claimed 5 total, but the gun camera only showed 4 engagements. Morrison explained that the 5th kill was the Ki-84 that another pilot had destroyed while it was attacking Oscar's unarmed aircraft. Oscar argued that he should receive credit because he had set up the situation by damaging the aircraft and keeping it defensive until help arrived. The other pilot had only delivered the final shots. The intelligence officers debated this for several minutes. Normally, kills were credited to the pilot who actually destroyed the aircraft with gunfire. But this was an unusual situation where Oscar had engaged the enemy while completely unarmed, had maneuvered aggressively enough to prevent being shot down himself, and had directly enabled another pilot to achieve the kill. After discussion, they decided to credit the kill to the pilot who had fired the final shots, but note in Oscar's record that he had assisted significantly. Therefore, Oscar's official tally was 4 confirmed kills from the August 13th mission. 4 aircraft destroyed by his guns, as documented by camera footage and witness statements. This was still an extraordinary achievement. 4 kills in a single mission qualified Oscar as an ace, since the definition required 5 total kills across an entire combat career. Oscar had achieved 4/5 of that in 15 minutes. But Morrison had additional information. He had reviewed Oscar's previous mission reports and found references to earlier engagements that had been classified as probables rather than confirmed kills due to insufficient evidence. One probable from a strafing mission in July. Oscar had claimed destroying an enemy aircraft on the ground, but ground fire had prevented observation of the results. Morrison suggested they review that claim again with the new evidence of Oscar's shooting accuracy demonstrated by yesterday's footage. After additional discussion, the intelligence officers agreed to upgrade one of Oscar's earlier probables to a confirmed kill based on the current evidence showing he was an accurate shooter who hit what he aimed at. This brought Oscar's total to 5 confirmed kills. 5 aircraft destroyed across his entire combat career, with 4 of those occurring in a single day. Oscar Perdomo was officially an ace. More specifically, he was an ace in a day, which was extraordinarily rare. The intelligence officers congratulated Oscar formally and informed him that his achievement would be forwarded to group headquarters for official recognition. A citation for the Distinguished Service Cross, or possibly the Silver Star, would be prepared. The 5-kill achievement would be documented in the permanent records and announced in the group newsletter. Oscar Perdomo had accomplished something that very few American pilots achieved during the entire war. Oscar accepted the congratulations with mixed emotions. Pride, certainly, but also awareness that 5 enemy pilots were dead because of his shooting. Satisfaction with his performance, but also knowledge that luck had played a significant role alongside skill. Relief that he had survived, tempered by recognition that many good pilots had died in combat through no fault of their own. War produced these complex contradictions constantly. The afternoon mission on August 14th proceeded normally. Oscar flew another bomber escort to Japan without encountering enemy aircraft. The mission was long and tedious, 8 hours of flying with 0 combat. He returned to Ieshima in the evening, having fired 0 rounds and seen 0 enemies. The contrast with yesterday was stark and somehow appropriate. Combat was random and unpredictable. Yesterday produced 5 kills. Today produced nothing except fatigue and fuel consumption. The evening of August 14th brought rumors that Japan was preparing to surrender. Radio intercepts suggested the Emperor was recording a message to be broadcast the following day. Pilots discussed what this meant while trying not to get their hopes too high. Rumors about the war ending had circulated for weeks without coming true. But the atomic bombs had changed the calculation fundamentally. Japan simply could not continue fighting against weapons that could erase entire cities instantly. August 15, 1945, began like any other day at Ieshima. Morning briefings, mission assignments, aircraft preparation. But at approximately noon local time, a radio broadcast from Tokyo confirmed what everyone had hoped. Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a recorded message that was broadcast throughout the empire. The war was over. After 3 years and 8 months of fighting across the Pacific, the killing would finally stop. The reaction at Ieshima was immediate and overwhelming. Pilots and ground crews celebrated wildly. Men who had flown combat missions for months or years without knowing if they would survive suddenly knew they would go home. The fear and stress that had been constant companions evaporated in moments. Alcohol appeared from hidden stockpiles. Parties erupted spontaneously. The mood was jubilant and relieved and exhausted simultaneously. Oscar participated in the celebration, but felt strangely detached from the euphoria around him. He was grateful the war had ended. He was relieved he would survive to meet his son, Kenneth, finally. But he also felt a profound exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. The stress of combat flying, the responsibility of killing enemies, the randomness of survival, all of it had accumulated over months until the burden felt crushing. Now that the war was over, that burden could finally be set down. But the memories would remain forever. The days immediately following the surrender were strange and anticlimactic. Missions continued being flown, but for different purposes. Fighter patrols over Japan watching for any resistance that might develop. Reconnaissance flights photographing the destruction. Escort missions for transport aircraft carrying occupation forces. The 57th Fighter Group transitioned from combat operations to occupation support within 48 hours of the surrender announcement. On August 19th, Oscar witnessed something that seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Two Japanese bombers, twin-engine Mitsubishi G4M aircraft that Americans called Betty, approached Ayeshima with white paint schemes and green cross markings indicating they carried diplomatic personnel rather than bombs. These aircraft carried the Japanese delegation that would negotiate the formal terms of surrender and occupation. The same airfield that had launched fighters to kill Japanese aircraft was now receiving Japanese diplomats arriving under safe passage guarantees. Oscar watched the White Bettys land, watched Japanese officers in formal uniforms emerge from the aircraft, watched the beginning of the end of the war he had fought. The juxtaposition was almost impossible to process. Days earlier, he had been killing men who flew aircraft like these. Now, those same aircraft carried diplomats who would formalize the surrender. War created these surreal contrasts constantly. The 57th Fighter Group remained on Ayeshima through September and October 1945. Occupation duties replaced combat missions. Pilots flew patrols over defeated Japan, watching for resistance that never materialized. The missions were long and boring, nothing like the intensity of combat, but still requiring the same long hours over water with the same risks from mechanical failure or weather. Several aircraft were lost to accidents during this period, which seemed particularly tragic after surviving combat only to die during occupation duties. In November 1945, Oscar received orders that would change his immediate future. The 57th Fighter Group was being transferred to Okinawa and would eventually be deactivated as part of the massive post-war demobilization. Pilots would be given choices about their military careers. Some would be offered regular commissions in the peacetime air forces. Most would be released from active duty and allowed to return to civilian life. Oscar had to decide which path he wanted. The decision was complicated. He had a wife and child waiting in Los Angeles. He had no civilian career established and no clear idea what he would do for employment. But the military offered job security, steady income, and the opportunity to continue flying, which had become his passion and identity. After considerable thought, Oscar decided to apply for a regular commission and remain in the service. The application process took several weeks. Oscar's combat record was reviewed. His 5 confirmed kills and ace status were noted favorably. His flight skills and officer qualities were evaluated. In December 1945, he received notification that his application had been approved. He would receive a regular commission as a first lieutenant in the United States Army Air Forces and would be retained on active duty after demobilization. The 57th Fighter Group transferred to Okinawa in January 1946. The move from Ieshima involved relocating personnel, equipment, and aircraft to the larger base on Okinawa, where occupation forces were being consolidated. The group continued flying patrol missions over Japan and surrounding waters through the spring of 1946, though the missions were becoming increasingly routine and pointless as Japan remained completely pacified under American occupation. In May 1946, the official order came through. The 57th Fighter Group would be deactivated effective June 30th, 1946. The group had existed since January 1941 and had served in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and the Pacific during the war. Now the unit would be eliminated as part of the post-war drawdown that was reducing the Army Air Forces from millions of personnel to a fraction of that strength. For Oscar, the deactivation meant reassignment to another unit or return to the United States for new assignment. He requested stateside assignment to be near his family, which he had not seen since deploying in September 1943. The request was approved. Oscar would return to the United States in July 1946 with orders to report to March Field in California for his next assignment. The final weeks at Okinawa were bittersweet. Oscar had flown with many of these pilots for over a year. They had trained together, deployed together, fought together, and survived together. Now they were scattering to different assignments or civilian life. Some would remain in military service. Most would not. The bonds forged in combat were being broken by the peace. On July 15, 1946, Oscar boarded a Navy transport ship at Okinawa for the voyage back to the United States. The ship carried hundreds of servicemen being repatriated after years overseas. The mood aboard was celebratory but tinged with melancholy. They were going home, which everyone wanted desperately, but they were leaving behind experiences and friendships that had defined their young adult lives. The transition from war to peace was proving more difficult emotionally than anyone had expected. The voyage across the Pacific took 3 weeks, stopping at various islands to pick up additional personnel and cargo. Oscar spent the time reading, sleeping, and thinking about what came next. He would finally meet his son, Kenneth, who was now 2 years old. He would reunite with Dorothy, who he had seen for only 2 weeks during his last leave in August 1943. He would have to learn to live as a peacetime officer rather than a combat pilot. None of this would be simple or automatic. Adjustments would be required. Patience would be necessary. The transport ship docked at San Diego on August 5th, 1946. Oscar walked down the gangway onto American soil for the first time in 3 years. California looked exactly as he remembered it. Sunny, clean, prosperous, completely untouched by the war that had devastated Asia and Europe. The contrast was jarring but welcome. This was home. This was what he had fought to protect. This was where his future would unfold. He took a bus from San Diego to Los Angeles, watching familiar landscapes pass by the window, the agricultural fields, the small towns, the growing suburbs. Everything looked peaceful and normal and completely divorced from the war he had just left. When the bus reached Los Angeles, Oscar retrieved his duffel bag and walked to the address where Dorothy and Kenneth were living with Dorothy's parents in Boyle Heights. Dorothy answered the door, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. Two people who had been married for 2.5 years, but had spent less than 3 weeks together in person. She looked older and more tired than he remembered, which was probably true for both of them. The war had aged everyone prematurely. Then they embraced, and the strangeness dissolved into genuine relief and happiness. Kenneth appeared behind his mother, a small boy with dark hair and curious eyes, staring at the stranger in the military uniform. Oscar knelt down to his son's level and extended his hand. Kenneth hesitated, then stepped forward cautiously. Oscar picked him up gently and held him, feeling the solid weight of his child for the first time. This was what he had fought for. This was what had been painted on the nose of his aircraft. This was why surviving mattered. The reunion was everything Oscar had hoped for, and somehow also inadequate. Too much time had passed. Too much had changed. Dorothy had raised Kenneth alone for 2 years while working and managing a household. Oscar had fought a war and killed enemies and survived experiences he could never fully explain. They were strangers who had to relearn how to be a family. The process would take time and effort and commitment from both of them. But standing in the small house in Boyle Heights, holding his son while his wife watched with tears streaming down her face, Oscar Perdomo felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Not for victory or survival or anything related to the war. Just simple hope that life could be good again, that families could be whole, that the future could be better than the past. The war was over. The killing had stopped. The meat chopper had been retired. Oscar Perdomo, the last ace in a day in United States military history, was home, and the rest of his life was just beginning. Oscar Perdomo reported to March Field in Riverside County, California, on August 15, 1946, exactly 1 year after Japan's surrender. March Field was a major Army Air Forces installation that had been operating since the 1920s and was now serving as a training and reassignment center for the post-war force structure. The base was crowded with personnel transitioning from wartime to peacetime duties, some staying in service, most being processed for discharge and return to civilian life. Oscar's assignment was to the 4th Fighter Group, a training unit responsible for maintaining pilot proficiency and developing tactics for the new jet aircraft that were beginning to replace propeller-driven fighters. The jets represented a revolutionary change in aviation, faster than anything with propellers, simpler mechanically with fewer moving parts, more demanding to fly due to higher speeds and different handling characteristics. The transition from piston engines to jet engines was as significant as the transition from biplanes to monoplanes had been a decade earlier. But Oscar didn't transition to jets immediately. The Air Forces still operated large numbers of P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, and other propeller fighters that required experienced pilots to train new replacements and maintain unit readiness. Oscar spent the last months of 1946 flying P-47s again, the familiar Thunderbolt that had carried him through combat in the Pacific. The missions were training flights rather than combat operations, formation flying, gunnery practice, navigation exercises, simulated combat. All the skills that combat pilots needed but practiced in peacetime without the risk of enemy fire. The routine was comfortable and boring simultaneously. Flying was still flying, and Oscar loved being in the air. But training missions lacked the intensity and purpose of combat operations. He was simply accumulating flight hours and maintaining proficiency without contributing to any larger objective. The peacetime military was proving to be very different from the wartime organization he had known for 4 years. Dorothy and Kenneth had moved from Los Angeles to Riverside to be near March Field. They rented a small house off base where Oscar could live with his family when not on duty. This was Oscar's first extended period living as a husband and father rather than a deployed serviceman. The adjustment was difficult for everyone. Kenneth barely knew his father and treated him with the cautious distance appropriate for a familiar stranger. Dorothy had established routines and habits during 2 years of single parenting that didn't automatically accommodate Oscar's presence and expectations. Oscar himself struggled with transitioning from the structured military environment, where his role was clear, to the domestic environment, where his role was ambiguous. But the family gradually found its equilibrium through patient effort from everyone. Oscar learned to be present and engaged with Kenneth, playing with him, reading to him, establishing the father-son bond that had been impossible when separated by 8,000 miles and a war. Dorothy adjusted to sharing parenting responsibilities and household management with Oscar rather than handling everything herself. Kenneth slowly accepted that this man in the uniform was his father and was staying permanently rather than visiting briefly. By early 1947, the family dynamic had stabilized into something approaching normal. Oscar's flight schedule was predictable with reasonable hours and minimal weekend duty. Dorothy found work as a clerk at the base exchange, contributing additional income and finding adult interaction outside the home. Kenneth attended nursery school and was developing into a bright, curious child who showed his father's mechanical aptitude and his mother's social skills. Then, in September 1947, the military structure changed fundamentally. The United States Air Force was established as an independent service branch, separate from the Army. The Army Air Forces became the United States Air Force with its own command structure, budget, and operational autonomy. For personnel, this meant new uniforms, new insignia, new organizational charts, and new career paths. Oscar transferred from the Army to the Air Force automatically, along with all other aviation personnel. His rank remained the same, but his service branch changed. He was now an Air Force officer rather than an Army officer. The newly independent Air Force was enthusiastic about embracing jet technology and moving beyond the propeller aircraft that had dominated World War II. New jet fighters were being developed and deployed rapidly. The Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star was already operational. The Republic F-84 Thunderjet was entering service. The North American F-86 Sabre was under development. These aircraft represented the future of air combat, and the Air Force needed experienced pilots to transition to them and develop appropriate tactics. In January 1948, Oscar began jet transition training in the P-80 Shooting Star. The P-80 was America's first operational jet fighter, a sleek aircraft with a top speed exceeding 550 miles per hour. Flying it required adapting to fundamentally different characteristics compared to propeller fighters. The jet engine provided smooth, continuous power without the vibration and torque of piston engines and propellers. But the engine responded slowly to throttle inputs, requiring pilots to anticipate power needs rather than reacting in real time. The higher speeds made everything happen faster, reducing time available for decisions and reactions. Landing speeds were significantly higher, requiring longer runways and more precise speed control. Oscar adapted quickly to jet flying. His experience with the heavy P-47 Thunderbolt translated well to jets that shared similar weight and dive performance characteristics. By March 1948, he was qualified in the P-80 and was assigned to a fighter squadron flying operational missions. The missions remained training-focused, since no combat operations existed, but the flying was more challenging and interesting than the P-47 training missions had been. The years from 1948 through 1949 passed quietly for Oscar and his family. He flew regularly, accumulated flight hours in jets, participated in training exercises, and earned his regular pay. Dorothy worked part-time and managed the household. Kenneth grew from a toddler into a young boy attending elementary school. The family routine was stable and predictable and completely divorced from the chaos of war. Life was good in ways that Oscar had barely allowed himself to imagine during his combat deployment. Then, in June 1950, everything changed again. North Korea invaded South Korea with overwhelming force, crossing the 38th parallel and driving south toward Seoul and Busan. The invasion caught American intelligence and military planners by surprise, despite warning signs that had been building for months. President Truman responded quickly, committing American forces to defend South Korea under United Nations auspices. The United States was at war again, 5 years after the previous war had ended. The Air Force began mobilizing immediately, recalling reserve personnel and preparing units for deployment. Oscar's status was active duty regular officer, which meant he was automatically available for assignment to combat units without requiring recall from reserve status. Within days of the invasion, Oscar received preliminary notification that he might be assigned to Korea depending on how the war developed and what aircraft types were needed. The notification created immediate stress for the family. Dorothy had lived through 3 years of Oscar being deployed during World War II. She had raised Kenneth alone while wondering if Oscar would survive and return. The prospect of going through that experience again was terrifying and infuriating. They had barely established a stable family life. Kenneth was finally bonded with his father. Now the military was threatening to tear that apart again for another war in another distant country. Oscar shared Dorothy's concerns, but also felt professional obligation and personal interest pulling him toward combat service. He was a fighter pilot. Combat was what fighter pilots existed to do. The skills he possessed were needed in Korea, where American pilots would face Soviet-built MiG fighters, flown by North Korean, and eventually Chinese and Soviet pilots. His combat experience from World War II made him more valuable than newly trained pilots who had never faced enemy fire. He wanted to serve where his skills mattered most, even though he understood the cost to his family. The official orders came through on June 30, 1950. Captain Oscar Perdomo would report to Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada for combat refresher training, followed by deployment to the Far East Air Forces in Korea. Expected deployment date was August 1950. He had approximately 6 weeks to prepare himself and his family for another separation that might last months or years, depending on how long the war continued. The 6 weeks passed too quickly. Oscar completed refresher training at Nellis, requalifying in air-to-air combat tactics and gunnery. Dorothy made arrangements to move back to Los Angeles to live with her parents during Oscar's deployment, reducing expenses and providing family support for Kenneth. Kenneth, now 6 years old and old enough to understand what was happening, became withdrawn and quiet as the deployment date approached. He had finally gained a father who was present daily. Now that father was leaving again for unknown duration to fight in another war. Oscar deployed to Korea in late August 1950 aboard a military air transport service aircraft that carried personnel and equipment across the Pacific. The flight took over 20 hours with refueling stops in Hawaii and Japan before landing at Kimpo Air Base near Seoul. Kimpo was the same area where Oscar had shot down 5 aircraft on August 13, 1945, exactly 5 years earlier. The coincidence was striking and somewhat unsettling. He was returning to the same peninsula where he had last engaged in combat, fighting a different enemy, but in the same skies. The Korean War air combat environment was dramatically different from World War II Pacific operations. The primary threat was no longer Japanese piston-engine fighters, but Soviet-designed MiG-15 jet fighters flown by North Korean, Chinese, and covertly by Soviet pilots. The MiG-15 was a formidable aircraft, fast and maneuverable with a high service ceiling and heavy armament. American F-80. Shooting stars could compete, but were outperformed in several categories. The newer F-84 Thunderjets were better matched. The F-86 Sabres were superior in experienced hands, but were just beginning to arrive in theater in late 1950. Oscar was initially assigned to fly F-84E Thunderjets with the 27th Fighter Escort Wing based at Daegu Air Base in South Korea. The F-84 was a solid aircraft, reliable and well-armed, though not as fast or agile as the MiG-15. The missions were primarily ground attack and close air support for United Nations forces fighting North Korean and Chinese ground troops. Fighter escort missions for B-29 bombers also occurred regularly. Air-to-air combat happened, but was less frequent than ground attack missions. Oscar flew his first Korean War mission on September 5, 1950, a close air support mission against North Korean positions north of the Pusan perimeter. The mission involved 8 F-84s carrying rockets and bombs attacking enemy troop concentrations and supply lines. No enemy fighters appeared, and the mission proceeded without incident. Oscar expended his ordnance on the designated targets and returned to Taegu, having accomplished the mission objectives without drama. The pattern continued through September and October. Oscar flew ground attack missions regularly, bombing and strafing enemy positions, destroying trucks and tanks and artillery, supporting the United Nations offensive that pushed north after the Incheon landing, reversed the war's momentum. The missions were dangerous due to ground fire that could damage or destroy aircraft, but enemy fighters rarely appeared, and when they did, they typically avoided engaging the heavily armed F-84s. By November 1950, Oscar had flown 37 missions in Korea without encountering enemy fighters in air-to-air combat. The contrast with his World War II experience was notable. In the Pacific, he had flown 28 missions before finally engaging the enemy on his 29th mission and achieving 5 kills. In Korea, he was approaching 40 missions with 0 air combat. The difference reflected the different nature of the two wars. World War II had been total war with massive aerial battles. Korea was limited war with most combat focused on ground support rather than air superiority fights. Then, in late November, Chinese forces intervened in overwhelming numbers, crossing the Yalu River and attacking United Nations forces that had advanced close to the Chinese border. The Chinese offensive was massive and effective, driving United Nations forces south in desperate retreats. The Air Force shifted priorities from ground attack to defensive support, trying to slow the Chinese advance and protect withdrawing friendly forces. Oscar flew multiple missions daily during this crisis period, sometimes 3 or 4 missions in a single day, attacking Chinese columns and providing cover for retreating United Nations troops. The flying was exhausting and dangerous. Aircraft losses to ground fire increased significantly. Several pilots from his squadron were shot down and either killed or captured. The war that had seemed relatively manageable in September and October had transformed into desperate survival by December. In January 1951, F-86 Sabres began arriving in Korea in significant numbers. The F-86 was specifically designed to counter the MiG-15 and was superior in most performance categories when flown by experienced pilots. Oscar requested transition to the F-86 and was approved based on his combat experience and flight skills. In February 1951, he transitioned to the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing, flying F-86ES from Suwon Air Base. The F-86 Sabre was the finest jet fighter Oscar had flown. Fast, maneuverable, well-armed, and beautiful in a way that functional machines could be beautiful. Flying it felt natural and intuitive despite the sophisticated systems and high performance. Oscar took to the Sabre immediately and was operational within 2 weeks of beginning his transition training. F-86 missions were primarily focused on air superiority rather than ground attack. The Sabres flew combat air patrols over northwest Korea in an area called MiG Alley, where Chinese and North Korean MiG-15s operated from bases across the Yalu River in Manchuria. American rules of engagement prohibited attacking enemy aircraft on the ground in Manchuria, so the fighting occurred entirely in the air over North Korean territory. Oscar flew his first F-86 combat mission on March 2, 1951. The mission involved 16 Sabres flying a sweep over MiG Alley, searching for enemy fighters and engaging if encountered. The MiGs appeared at approximately 1100 hours, climbing from their Manchurian bases to intercept the American formation. The ensuing dogfight involved approximately 30 aircraft total at altitudes above 30,000 feet, where jet performance was optimal and human endurance was marginal. Oscar engaged a MiG-15 that was attempting to attack another Sabre from above. The engagement was brief and inconclusive. Oscar fired a burst that may have hit the MiG, but the enemy fighter broke away, trailing no visible damage, and the gun camera footage was insufficient to confirm whether rounds had connected. The engagement was classified as a probable rather than a confirmed kill. Over the following months, Oscar flew dozens of F-86 missions over MiG Alley. Most missions involved visual contact with enemy aircraft, but no actual combat engagement. The MiG pilots were cautious, often refusing to engage when outnumbered or disadvantageously positioned. The Chinese and North Korean pilots had specific orders to avoid losses and preserve their forces rather than fighting aggressively to achieve kills. This made them frustrating opponents who appeared and disappeared without committing to sustained combat. Oscar accumulated several more probable kills through mid-1951, but never achieved a confirmed kill in Korea. The gun camera requirements were strict. Hits had to be clearly visible. Significant damage had to be observed. The enemy aircraft had to be seen crashing, or the pilot had to be seen bailing out. Anything less than definitive evidence resulted in classification as probable or damaged rather than confirmed kill. Oscar's probables suggested he was hitting enemy aircraft, but not destroying them conclusively enough to receive official credit. By October 1951, Oscar had completed 100 missions in Korea, split roughly equally between F-84 ground attack and F-86 air combat. He had accumulated over 400 total combat missions between World War II and Korea. He was exhausted physically and mentally from sustained combat operations. The Air Force rotated him back to the United States for stateside assignment and recovery from combat stress. Oscar returned to March Field in California in November 1951 after 15 months in Korea. The reunion with Dorothy and Kenneth was joyful, but also strained. Kenneth was now 7 years old and had spent another year essentially without a father. Dorothy had endured another deployment, worrying constantly about whether Oscar would survive and return. The family bonds had to be rebuilt again, requiring patience and commitment from everyone. Oscar's stateside assignment was to the Fighter Weapons School at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, teaching advanced fighter tactics and weapons employment to experienced pilots. The assignment was perfect for his skills and experience. He had extensive combat experience in both World War II and Korea. He had flown multiple aircraft types, including the latest jets. He understood air combat tactically and could teach those skills effectively. The Fighter Weapons School was the Air Force's premier institution for developing fighter expertise, and Oscar was qualified to contribute at the highest level. The family moved to Las Vegas, where Oscar could commute to Nellis daily rather than living separately. Kenneth enrolled in a local school and began establishing friendships and stability that had been disrupted repeatedly by deployments and moves. Dorothy found work and built her own social network. The family routine stabilized again into something sustainable and healthy. Oscar taught at the Fighter Weapons School from November 1951 through December 1954, 3 years of productive service that was personally satisfying and professionally valuable. He developed curriculum, taught classes, flew demonstration missions, and mentored younger pilots who would carry his lessons forward. The work was important, even though it lacked the intensity of combat. Teaching others to survive and succeed in air combat was arguably more valuable than individual combat achievements. Then, in February 1955, an incident occurred that demonstrated Oscar still possessed the skills and nerve that had made him successful in combat. He was flying a Lockheed T-33 Shooting Star trainer aircraft with a student pilot in the rear seat. The T-33 was a two-seat variant of the F-80 fighter used extensively for training and proficiency flying. The mission was a routine instrument training flight at 20,000 feet over the Nevada desert. Approximately 30 minutes into the flight, Oscar detected a strong odor of aviation fuel in the cockpit. He checked his fuel gauges and warning lights, but saw no obvious indications of problems. But the fuel smell was intensifying rapidly, which meant fuel was leaking somewhere and vaporizing inside the aircraft. Fuel vapor in a confined space with hot engine components and electrical systems created extreme fire and explosion risk. Oscar informed the student of the situation and declared an emergency with air traffic control. He began an immediate descent toward Nellis Air Force Base while running emergency checklists. The fuel smell became overwhelming within seconds, burning his eyes and making breathing difficult even through the oxygen mask. The student in the rear seat reported similar symptoms and worse. The cockpit visibility was degrading as fuel vapors created a haze that obscured the instruments. Most pilots would have ejected at this point. The situation was clearly catastrophic and deteriorating. Ejection was the safe option, the textbook response to fuel leaks with vapor saturation. Both pilots could eject safely, the aircraft would crash in the desert, and everyone would survive with no injuries beyond the standard bruises and minor trauma from ejection itself. But ejection meant losing the aircraft, which was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars and was badly needed for the training mission. It also meant putting the student at risk, since ejections always carried some danger of injury or malfunction. Oscar made a different decision. He would attempt to land the aircraft despite the fuel leak and vapor saturation. The student would remain in the aircraft rather than ejecting. They would fly this emergency together and bring the T-33 down intact if possible. It was risky and arguably unnecessary given that ejection was available, but it was also professional and demonstrated absolute confidence in his abilities. He descended rapidly toward Nellis, maintaining precise control despite the fuel vapors that were now so thick he could barely see his instruments. The control tower was notified of the emergency and crash crews were positioned along the runway. Oscar entered the traffic pattern at high speed, configured for landing, and began his final approach. The fuel smell was almost unbearable. His eyes were streaming tears from the chemical irritation. His lungs burned from inhaling fuel vapors, even through the oxygen mask. But his hands remained steady on the controls, and his mind remained focused on the landing. The T-33 touched down smoothly on the runway centerline. Oscar deployed the drag chute to slow the aircraft quickly and minimize rollout distance. The aircraft decelerated normally, and he turned off the runway onto a taxiway where fire trucks were waiting. He shut down the engine immediately, secured all systems, and both pilots evacuated the aircraft rapidly in case fire developed. No fire occurred. The ground crews discovered the source of the leak quickly. A fuel line connection had failed, allowing fuel to spray into the fuselage bay where it vaporized and filled the cockpit through the environmental system. The leak was severe enough that another few minutes of flight might have resulted in catastrophic fire or explosion. Oscar's decision to land immediately rather than continuing to fly or delaying for checklist procedures had prevented disaster. His ability to execute a precision landing while essentially blind from fuel vapor exposure demonstrated extraordinary skill. The incident was documented formally, and Oscar received a commendation for his actions. More importantly, the incident reminded everyone, including Oscar himself, that combat skills and nerve didn't disappear just because the shooting stopped. He was 46 years old, 17 years past his ace-in-a-day achievement, but still capable of performing under extreme pressure with lives at stake. Oscar continued teaching at the Fighter Weapons School through 1957. By this point, he had accumulated 20 years of military service, a natural milestone for considering retirement. The Air Force offered regular officers who completed 20 years the option to retire with pension benefits calculated as 50% of base pay. The pension would provide financial security and allow transition to civilian life while still relatively young. Oscar discussed the decision extensively with Dorothy and Kenneth, who was now 13 years old and developing into a teenager. The family had moved frequently during Oscar's career, disrupting Kenneth's schooling and friendships. Dorothy had endured multiple deployments and extended separations. Both wanted stability and permanence that military life couldn't provide. Oscar himself was ready for something different after 2 decades of military service, including extensive combat operations in 2 wars. In August 1957, Oscar submitted his application for retirement, effective January 1958. The application was approved routinely. He would retire with the rank of major, 20 years of service, 2 wars of combat experience, 5 confirmed kills from World War II, including the distinction of being the last ace in a day, and a career of honorable professional military service. The final months of active duty were spent preparing for transition to civilian life. Oscar needed to find civilian employment since the military pension alone wasn't sufficient to support his family comfortably. He had no college degree and no civilian work experience except for manual labor before the war. But he had extensive mechanical knowledge, management experience from his military leadership roles, and a proven record of responsibility and professionalism. He applied for several positions in aviation-related industries in the Los Angeles area. Several companies were interested in hiring military veterans with aviation backgrounds for positions ranging from maintenance supervision to flight test operations. In November 1957, Oscar accepted a position with North American Aviation as a production test pilot, flying newly manufactured aircraft to verify they met specifications before delivery to military or civilian customers. The work would use his flying skills in a civilian context with stable hours, no deployments, and reasonable pay. On January 15, 1958, Major Oscar Francis Perdomo retired from the United States Air Force after 20 years and 2 months of active service. The retirement ceremony at Nellis Air Force Base was small and informal. A few colleagues attended. Dorothy and Kenneth were present. Oscar received his retirement certificate and final military identification. Then he removed his uniform for the last time and transitioned to civilian status. The transition was both relief and loss. Relief from the stress and uncertainty of military life. Relief from the possibility of future deployments and combat. Relief from the constant moving and disruption that military service required. But also loss of identity and purpose and community that had defined his adult life. For 20 years, Oscar had been a military officer and fighter pilot. Now, he was a civilian employee working for an aerospace company. The change was profound and would require substantial adjustment. But walking out of Nellis Air Force Base for the final time with Dorothy and Kenneth beside him, Oscar Perdomo felt something he had rarely experienced during his military career: peace. Not just the absence of war, but genuine internal peace about his choices and his future. He had served honorably. He had fought courageously. He had survived when many hadn't. He had contributed meaningfully to his country's wars and its peacetime military. That service was complete. Now came the rest of his life, whatever that would bring. and for the first time in decades, that future felt open and hopeful rather than predetermined and dangerous. Oscar Perdomo began his civilian career at North American Aviation in February 1958, reporting to the company's production facility in Downey, California, where F-86 Sabres and other military aircraft were manufactured. His position as production test pilot required flying newly built aircraft through acceptance test profiles to verify they met contractual specifications before delivery to military customers. The work used his extensive flying experience, but without the stress and danger of combat operations. The test flights were methodical and routine by design. Each aircraft followed identical test procedures, engine performance checks at various power settings and altitudes, control surface responses verified across the flight envelope, electrical systems tested, hydraulic systems tested, communication and navigation equipment tested, emergency systems tested. The flights typically lasted 2 to 3 hours and required precise adherence to documented checklists and procedures. No creativity or improvisation was encouraged or allowed, just systematic verification that the aircraft performed exactly as designed. Oscar found the work satisfying initially. Flying remained flying regardless of the mission profile. The aircraft were beautifully built and performed flawlessly when properly manufactured. The pay was adequate and reliable. The hours were predictable with weekends free and no deployments or separations from family. After 20 years of military service with its uncertainties and disruptions, the stability was welcome and valuable. The family had settled in El Segundo, a small city adjacent to Los Angeles International Airport where many aerospace workers lived. The house was modest but comfortable, a 3-bedroom, single-story structure in a neighborhood where other families had similar backgrounds and economic circumstances. Dorothy worked part-time as a medical receptionist, contributing additional income and finding satisfaction in work outside the home. Kenneth attended El Segundo High School and was developing into a capable student with interests in mechanics and aviation that clearly reflected his father's influence. The late 1950s and early 1960s were stable, prosperous years for the Perdomo family. Oscar worked steadily at North American Aviation, accumulating flight hours in various aircraft types as the company's production shifted from F-86 Sabres to newer designs. Dorothy maintained the household and enjoyed the freedom to pursue her own interests without constant worry about Oscar being deployed to combat zones. Kenneth progressed through high school, participated in sports and social activities, and began considering his future beyond secondary education. But the stability masked underlying tensions that would eventually surface. Oscar struggled with the transition from military to civilian life more than he acknowledged or even consciously recognized. Military service had provided clear purpose and identity. Combat flying had delivered intense experiences that nothing in civilian life could replicate. Test flying was professional and important, but fundamentally boring compared to combat. Oscar missed the intensity and camaraderie and sense of mission that military service had provided, even though he didn't want to return to that life with its dangers and disruptions. He began drinking more regularly in the early 1960s, initially just beer or wine with dinner, but gradually increasing to harder liquor consumed earlier in the day and in larger quantities. Dorothy noticed and worried but didn't confront the issue directly, hoping it would resolve itself without intervention. Kenneth noticed his father's changing behavior and withdrew somewhat, spending more time with friends and less time at home. The family dynamic was shifting in unhealthy directions, but slowly enough that addressing the problems seemed less urgent than avoiding conflict. Kenneth graduated from El Segundo High School in June 1965 at age 19, having been held back 1 year during elementary school due to the disruptions caused by Oscar's military deployments. He had average grades and no clear plans for college or career. The Vietnam War was escalating rapidly, and the draft was expanding. Young men his age faced limited choices: attend college and obtain student deferment, find essential employment that qualified for occupational deferment. Join the military voluntarily and choose your service branch and specialty. Wait to be drafted and accept whatever assignment the Army gave you. Kenneth discussed his options with Oscar extensively during the summer of 1965. Oscar advised against military service, knowing from personal experience the costs and dangers of combat. But Kenneth felt obligated to serve, influenced by family heritage and his father's example. If Oscar had fought in 2 wars and survived with distinction, Kenneth could serve his own generation's war and contribute honorably. In September 1965, Kenneth enlisted in the United States Army with a guaranteed assignment to helicopter crew training. The Vietnam War needed helicopter crews desperately. Helicopters were being used extensively for troop transport, medical evacuation, close air support, and reconnaissance. Crews suffered high casualty rates, but the missions were critical to the war effort. Kenneth would train as a door gunner on UH-1 Iroquois helicopters that everyone called Hueys. Oscar was conflicted about Kenneth's decision: pride that his son wanted to serve, fear about the dangers Kenneth would face, guilt that his own military career might have influenced Kenneth's choice. Awareness that Vietnam was a different kind of war with different rules and different outcomes than World War II or Korea. The statistics on helicopter crew casualties were grim. Door gunners were particularly vulnerable, exposed to enemy fire from all angles while operating their machine guns during combat operations. Kenneth completed basic training at Fort Ord in California, then helicopter crew training at Fort Rucker in Alabama. The training was intensive and realistic, preparing crews for the demanding environment they would face in Vietnam. Kenneth excelled at the technical aspects of crew duties and weapons operation. His mechanical aptitude, inherited from Oscar, made him naturally competent at maintaining and operating the M60 machine guns that door gunners used. His letters home during training were enthusiastic and confident. He believed in the mission. He was ready to serve. He would make his father proud. In May 1966, Specialist 4th Class Kenneth Perdomo deployed to Vietnam, assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division operating in the Central Highlands. His letters home described the intense heat, the constant missions, the danger from ground fire, and the satisfaction of supporting American troops engaged in combat operations. He flew multiple missions daily, transporting troops into landing zones under fire, evacuating wounded soldiers to medical facilities, providing covering fire during combat assaults. The work was exactly what he had trained for, and he performed it well. Oscar read Kenneth's letters with growing anxiety despite the upbeat tone. He knew combat intimately. He understood the randomness of survival and death. He recognized that enthusiasm and skill didn't guarantee survival when bullets and rockets were flying. Dorothy shared his concerns but tried to remain optimistic. Kenneth was smart and trained and cautious. He would come home safely when his tour ended. They just had to endure the year of separation and constant worry. The war continued escalating through 1966 and 1967. American troop strength in Vietnam increased to over 500,000 personnel. Combat operations expanded across South Vietnam. Casualties mounted steadily. The television news showed helicopter operations extensively, giving Americans at home vivid images of the war their sons were fighting. Oscar and Dorothy watched the news obsessively, searching for information about the 1st Cavalry Division, analyzing casualty reports, dreading the possibility that military personnel would appear at their door with notification of Kenneth's death. Kenneth completed his initial one-year tour in May 1967 and returned to the United States for 30 days of leave before reassignment. The reunion was joyful, but also revealed changes. Kenneth had matured significantly during his year in combat. He was more serious, more careful with his words, more aware of mortality and chance. He drank heavily during his leave, which concerned both Oscar and Dorothy, but seemed understandable given the stress he had experienced. He described his combat missions matter-of-factly, without dramatization, focusing on technical details rather than emotional experiences. After his leave, Kenneth received orders for a second Vietnam tour, which was becoming common as the war consumed personnel faster than the training pipeline could replace them. Experienced helicopter crew members were desperately needed. Kenneth could have requested a different assignment or even separated from the Army, but he chose to return to Vietnam for a second tour with his same unit. He felt loyalty to his crew members and responsibility to contribute where he was needed most. Oscar tried to convince Kenneth not to return. One tour was sufficient. He had done his duty. The odds of surviving a second tour were worse than surviving the first, but Kenneth was determined. He would serve another year and then separate from the Army and return to civilian life. Just 12 more months, then it would be over. Oscar recognized Kenneth's determination and stopped arguing, knowing that some decisions were personal and couldn't be changed by parental concern. Kenneth deployed for his second tour in August 1967. His letters from this deployment were different from his first tour, less enthusiastic, more fatalistic. He described the same missions and the same dangers, but with an undertone of weariness and resignation. The war wasn't going well. American forces were winning tactical battles, but not achieving strategic objectives. The enemy was resilient and determined. Casualties continued mounting without corresponding progress toward ending the war. Oscar's drinking increased significantly during Kenneth's second deployment. He was consuming a bottle of whiskey daily by early 1968, starting in the afternoon and continuing through the evening until he passed out. Dorothy confronted him about the drinking multiple times, but Oscar refused to acknowledge it as a problem. He was handling the stress the only way he knew how. The alcohol numbed the constant fear about Kenneth. It helped him sleep despite the nightmares that had begun occurring regularly. It was self-medication for anxiety that felt overwhelming and unmanageable through any other means. Kenneth completed his second tour in August 1968 and returned home safely. He had survived 2 years of combat flying as a helicopter door gunner, which was statistically remarkable given the casualty rates for that position. He separated from the Army in September 1968 with an honorable discharge and the intention to pursue civilian life and put the war behind him. But readjusting to civilian life proved difficult for Kenneth, just as it had for Oscar 20 years earlier. The skills and experiences that made someone effective in combat didn't translate directly to civilian employment. Kenneth found work as an auto mechanic in Los Angeles, using his mechanical skills productively, but without the intensity and purpose that military service had provided. He lived with his parents while saving money and considering his longer-term options. The relationship between Oscar and Kenneth was strained during this period. Both men had combat experience they couldn't adequately discuss with each other or anyone else. Both struggled with transitioning from military to civilian life. Both used alcohol as a coping mechanism for stress and traumatic memories. They understood each other too well and not well enough simultaneously. The mutual understanding should have created connection, but instead created distance, because neither wanted to acknowledge the problems they both shared. In early 1970, Kenneth made a decision that shocked both his parents. He re-enlisted in the Army and requested assignment back to Vietnam for a third tour. His explanation was practical rather than idealistic. The civilian job market was difficult. Military pay was reliable. He had skills that were valuable in Vietnam, but not particularly valuable in civilian life. One more tour would provide additional savings and career options when he finally separated permanently. Oscar reacted with anger and incomprehension. Kenneth had survived 2 tours through incredible luck. Pushing that luck with a 3rd tour was suicidal. The odds eventually caught up with everyone. No one survived forever in combat. Kenneth was making a terrible mistake driven by inability to adjust to civilian life rather than rational career planning. But Kenneth was an adult and could make his own decisions regardless of parental objections. Kenneth deployed for his 3rd tour in March 1970. He was assigned again to the 1st Cavalry Division, flying UH-1 helicopters in the Central Highlands. His letters home were brief and infrequent, lacking the detail and optimism of his earlier deployments. He was going through the motions, completing missions, counting days until his tour ended, surviving through routine and experience rather than enthusiasm or belief in the mission. On May 5th, 1970, Kenneth's helicopter crashed and exploded approximately 5 miles southwest of Puoc Vinh in South Vietnam. The crash occurred during a routine troop transport mission. The cause was never definitively determined. Possible mechanical failure, possible enemy fire, possible pilot error. The investigation was inconclusive. What was certain was that Specialist 4th Class Chris Mitchell Perdomo was killed in the crash, along with 2 other crew members. He was 24 years old. He had survived 2 complete combat tours and had been 2 months into his 3rd when he died. The notification arrived at the Perdomo house on May 6th. 2 Army officers in dress uniforms appearing at the door in mid-afternoon. Dorothy answered and understood immediately why they were there. The formal notification followed protocol exactly. The Secretary of the Army regrets to inform you that your son, Specialist 4th Class Chris Mitchell Perdomo, was killed in action in the Republic of Vietnam on May 5, 1970. Additional details would be provided when available. Remains would be returned to the United States for burial. Survivor benefits would be processed. The officers expressed condolences and departed. Dorothy was devastated but functional, immediately making notifications to family members and beginning the terrible administrative process that accompanies military deaths. Oscar was at work when the notification arrived. Dorothy called North American Aviation and requested they inform Oscar that he needed to return home immediately for a family emergency. When Oscar arrived home and learned that Kenneth had been killed, something inside him broke completely and irreparably. The grief was overwhelming and absolute. Oscar had survived Japanese fighters and Korean MiGs and jet fuel fires and countless other dangers across 20 years of military service. He had killed enemies and watched friends die and made peace with the randomness of survival and death in combat. But he could not survive the death of his son. The loss destroyed him in ways that combat never had. He blamed himself for Kenneth's military service. His own example had influenced Kenneth to enlist. His combat stories had glamorized war and made it seem acceptable or even desirable. His inability to help Kenneth adjust to civilian life after his first 2 tours had driven Kenneth back to Vietnam for the fatal 3rd tour. Every decision and action Oscar had taken had led directly to Kenneth's death. That was the narrative his grief constructed, and he believed it completely, despite knowing rationally that Kenneth had made his own choices. The funeral occurred in Los Angeles with full military honors. Kenneth was buried at Los Angeles National Cemetery with a 21-gun salute and taps played by a military bugler. Oscar attended the funeral but was barely present emotionally. He stood beside the gravesite, staring blankly, while Dorothy wept and relatives offered condolences that meant nothing and changed nothing. Kenneth was dead. Oscar's son was gone forever. Nothing else mattered. After the funeral, Oscar's drinking accelerated from heavy to catastrophic. He was consuming 2 bottles of whiskey daily, starting immediately after waking and continuing until unconsciousness. He stopped going to work. North American Aviation placed him on medical leave initially, then terminated his employment when he failed to return after exhausting his leave time. He stopped bathing, stopped eating regularly, stopped maintaining even basic self-care. His entire existence focused on drinking enough to achieve unconsciousness so he didn't have to think about Kenneth's death. Dorothy tried to help, but couldn't reach him. She arranged counseling that Oscar refused to attend. She contacted the Veterans Administration about treatment programs that Oscar ignored completely. She pleaded with him to stop drinking and start living again. Nothing worked. Oscar was drowning in alcohol and grief and guilt, and he had no interest in being rescued. He wanted to die. The alcohol was simply the slowest available method of suicide. The years from 1970 through 1976 were a slow-motion collapse. Oscar and Dorothy's marriage disintegrated under the weight of unprocessed grief and Oscar's alcoholism. They separated in 1972, though never formally divorced. Dorothy moved to a small apartment and tried to rebuild her life. Oscar remained in the house, living alone, drinking constantly, existing rather than living. Friends and family attempted interventions that failed. Veterans organizations reached out with support that Oscar rejected. He was beyond help because he didn't want help. He wanted Kenneth back, and since that was impossible, he wanted nothing. His health deteriorated predictably. Liver damage from chronic alcohol abuse, malnutrition from inadequate diet, general physical decline from lack of exercise and self-care. By early 1976, Oscar was only 56 years old, but looked 20 years older. His body was shutting down systematically, destroyed by 6 years of sustained alcohol poisoning. He was dying, and he knew it, and he didn't care. On March 2, 1976, Oscar Perdomo died at his home in El Segundo, California. The cause of death was listed as heart failure secondary to chronic alcoholism and related conditions. He died alone in the house he had shared with Dorothy and Kenneth. A neighbor discovered his body 2 days later when mail began accumulating and nobody answered the door. The police investigation determined the death was from natural causes related to chronic health problems. No autopsy was performed. The body was released to family for disposition. Dorothy arranged a simple cremation per Oscar's previously stated wishes. No funeral service, no military ceremony, no public memorial. Oscar had specified in discussions years earlier that when he died, he wanted his ashes scattered over the Pacific Ocean, where he had flown combat missions and where so many of his wartime companions had died. Dorothy honored this wish. She chartered a small boat, sailed several miles offshore from Los Angeles, and scattered Oscar's ashes over the water while saying a private goodbye to the man she had married 32 years earlier. Oscar Francis Perdomo was gone, the last ace in a day in United States military history. The man who had shot down 5 enemy aircraft in 6 minutes over Korea on August 13, 1945. The fighter pilot who had charged an armed enemy with empty guns and survived through nerve and bluff. The father who had lost his son to the same type of war he had survived himself. The man who could survive Japanese fighters but couldn't survive grief. All of it ended with ashes falling into the Pacific Ocean and dispersing in the current. The obituary in the Los Angeles Times was brief. Oscar Francis Perdomo, age 56, died March 2nd at his residence, born April 17, 1919, in Los Angeles. Served United States Army Air Forces and United States Air Force 1942 through 1958. Retired as Major, predeceased by son Chris Mitchell Perdomo, killed in action, Vietnam, 1970, survived by estranged wife Dorothy. No service per deceased wishes, ashes scattered at sea. The obituary mentioned nothing about 5 confirmed kills, nothing about being the last ace in a day, nothing about the Distinguished Service Cross or the other decorations Oscar had earned, nothing about surviving 2 wars and flying hundreds of combat missions. The writer didn't know those details, and nobody thought to provide them. Oscar passed from life to death to memory with minimal documentation and no public recognition of his extraordinary achievements. But the achievement endured regardless of recognition or celebration. The official records documented everything. 5 confirmed aerial victories on August 13, 1945. 3 Nakajima Key, 84. Frank fighters, and 1 Yokosuka K, 5Y Willow trainer destroyed by gunfire. 1 additional Key 84 damaged sufficiently to receive kill credit. Total 5 victories in a single day of combat. The last American pilot to achieve that distinction. The record stood verified and unchallenged in the archives of the United States Air Force. Oscar's combat performance that day had been objectively exceptional. 5 aircraft destroyed in approximately 15 minutes of combat. 3,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition expended with devastating accuracy. An unarmed bluff against an armed enemy that succeeded through nerve and tactical understanding. A 750-mile return flight completed safely, despite empty guns and tight fuel margins. All of it executed 2 days before the war ended, making Oscar the last ace in a day in a war that was the last war where such achievements were possible. The jet age that followed changed aerial combat fundamentally. Missiles replaced guns as primary weapons. Engagements occurred at longer ranges with less visual contact. Pilot skill remained important, but technology became more decisive. The one-on-one dogfights where individual pilots could achieve multiple kills in single missions became increasingly rare and eventually essentially impossible. Oscar's achievement on August 13, 1945, was the end of an era in aerial warfare. The Commemorative Air Force, an organization dedicated to preserving and flying historic aircraft, eventually acquired a P-47 Thunderbolt that was restored and painted to replicate Lil May's meat chopper. The nose art showed the same baby with the cigar and derby hat that had decorated Oscar's combat aircraft. The aircraft appeared at air shows across the United States, introducing new generations to the story of the last ace in a day, and the mission flown over Korea 2 days before the war ended. Oscar's name appeared on the memorial wall at the United States Air Force Memorial in Arlington, Virginia, along with thousands of other airmen who had served with distinction. His personal papers and some artifacts were preserved in the archives of the San Diego Air and Space Museum, where researchers could access them. His Distinguished Service Cross citation remained part of the official record, documenting extraordinary heroism in combat. The documentation existed for anyone who cared to look, preserving Oscar's achievements for history, even though the man himself was gone. The contrast between the achievement and the ending was stark and tragic. Oscar Perdomo had accomplished something remarkable that fewer than 100 American pilots achieved during the entire Second World War. He had survived that war and Korea and 20 years of military service and a dangerous civilian aviation career. He had earned recognition and respect and a place in military aviation history. But none of that saved him from grief when his son died. None of that prevented the alcoholism that killed him. None of that gave him the strength or tools to survive personal loss the way he had survived combat losses. The lesson, if there was one, was that heroism in combat doesn't automatically translate to strength in civilian life. That surviving war doesn't guarantee surviving peace. that killing enemies is sometimes easier than dealing with grief, that the skills and qualities that make someone effective in combat might actually make them vulnerable in civilian circumstances where those skills don't apply, and that intensity can't be satisfied. Oscar Perdomo was a warrior who lived in an era when warriors were needed and valued. He performed extraordinarily when the nation required extraordinary performance. He contributed meaningfully to winning wars that needed to be won. But when the wars ended and warriors weren't needed anymore, he struggled to find purpose and meaning in ordinary life. When tragedy struck his family, he lacked the resources to cope and chose alcohol as his response. That choice killed him as surely as enemy fire had killed so many of his wartime companions. His legacy is complex and contradictory like the man himself. The achievement on August 13, 1945, remains historically significant and impressive. 5 kills in 6 minutes. Empty guns, the bluff, the survival, the last ace in a day. This deserves recognition and remembrance. But the death from alcoholism 6 years after his son was killed in Vietnam is also part of the story. The inability to cope with grief, the self-destruction through drinking, the lonely death in a house in El Segundo. This deserves acknowledgement as well. Military history tends to focus on achievements and celebrate victories while minimizing or ignoring the costs and consequences. Oscar Perdomo's story includes both. He achieved something extraordinary in combat. He also paid a terrible price in grief and loss and ultimate self-destruction. Both aspects are true, both matter. Understanding both provides a more complete and honest picture of what war costs individuals even when they survive the actual fighting. August 13, 1945, 48 hours before the end of the deadliest war in human history. 38 American Thunderbolts against 50-plus Japanese fighters over Korea. One pilot from East Los Angeles, the son of a Mexican immigrant who had ridden with Pancho Villa, flying an aircraft named after his infant son. 5 kills in 15 minutes. 0 ammunition remaining. 750 miles from home. The meat chopper earned its name that morning. Oscar Perdomo earned his place in history. May 5, 1970, 25 years after that achievement. A UH-1 helicopter crashed in South Vietnam. Specialist 4th Class Chris Mitchell Perdomo was killed along with 2 other crew members. The baby with the cigar and derby hat, now a young man of 24, died in a war his father had survived. Oscar Perdomo never recovered from that loss. March 2, 1976. Oscar Francis Perdomo died in El Segundo, California, age 56, destroyed by grief and alcohol and inability to survive peace after surviving war. His ashes were scattered over the Pacific Ocean, returning to the sky and sea one final time. The record remains. The last ace in a day. 5 confirmed kills on August 13, 1945. The achievement that will never be repeated because warfare changed and that type of combat became obsolete. Oscar Perdomo stands alone in American military history with a distinction that is permanent and unique. The man is gone. The son is gone. The wife moved on with her life and eventually passed away herself. The house in El Segundo was sold to another family. The physical traces of Oscar Perdomo's life disappeared, as all physical traces eventually do. But the record endures in archives and museums and memorial walls. The story endures in histories of aerial combat and accounts of the last days of World War II. The achievement endures because it was real and documented and extraordinary. Oscar Perdomo, the last ace in a day. The warrior who survived war but couldn't survive peace. The father who lost his son to the same military service that had defined his own life. The man who charged enemies with empty guns but couldn't fight grief with any weapon. the hero who died alone. All of it true, all of it part of the same complicated, contradictory story of one man's life and death and legacy. The story deserves to be remembered and told not just because of the achievement on August 13th, 1945, though that alone would justify remembrance, but also because of what happened after, because of Kenneth's death and Oscar's grief and the alcoholism and the lonely death. Because the full story is more truthful and more human than the simple heroic narrative. Because understanding the costs helps us understand the price that warriors pay even when they survive the fighting. Oscar Francis Perdomo, 1919 to 1976. Last ace in a day, fighter pilot, father, husband, alcoholic, hero, tragic figure. All of these things simultaneously, remembered not just for what he achieved, but for what he lost. Honored not just for his courage in combat, but understood for his inability to cope with grief in peace. The complete story, the full truth, the legacy that endures.